Hi everyone. Good to see you on my channel today. Today I will tell you a wonderful story. It is full of love and kindness. I hope you enjoy it and I wish you an enjoyable viewing experience. Thank you.
The news that Amanda and Oliver had decided to get married came as a complete surprise to the villagers. Of course, you can't hide anything in the village. And people were saying that the two were sort of dating. But how did they date? They stopped and talked. That's all they met. They didn't even gossip about it, because they knew there was nothing going on between them. I mean, who's Oliver? He's a vet. Graduated from college, I think. He came here to work after his studies. So he's not even Oliver, but Oliver Andreevich. A respected man, and a stranger to the village, because he's considered a city dweller and a scientist. Amanda, in fact, is Amanda only on her passport, but the whole village knows her as Emmy. Of course, nobody would say anything bad about her. On the contrary, everyone thought that she was a good girl, hard-working, modest and pretty. She didn't leave the village after finishing school. She joined a farm as a milkmaid. And this, by rural standards, is also a positive quality. And they have a farm, not a bad house, though not a new one. A vegetable garden, animals, so she's a good bride, but that's for the local grooms. What did Oliver see in her? It was strange to people, and some of them were even offended, but they did not ask questions. The two young men decided to marry, and that was fine, though some doubted the strength of the union. He will hang around here and go back to the city. But whether he will take her with him is unknown. Who needs her there in the city? And he's not really interested here either. He needs her house and household, the evil tongues speculated. But so far everything seemed to be fine with them. They had a proper wedding. The bride looked quite happy, and the groom too. Some even thought that maybe Emmy was different from other girls, since the vet saw something special in her. Maybe she'd study. After all, she'd finished school as well as anyone. Why didn't she go to the city right away? Where could she go if her father died a few years ago and her mother was ill? Who would her daughter leave her for? And now that she's a married woman, maybe she'll go to school herself. Why not? But a couple of months after the wedding, it became clear why the marriage took place. People saw Amanda's belly growing. The wedding was only in October. Now the New Year holidays have not yet come, and she is clearly not 2 months, and all 5. That is, apparently, meetings between the vet and the dairymaid were limited not only to talk, and somewhere in the summer they went out more significantly. But this again speaks of Oliver's seriousness. He did not abandon the girl, did not refuse. Married, and they live as they should. No one will say anything bad. So God bless them. True, during Amanda's pregnancy there was a misfortune. Her mother died. She was not really a woman of age, but she had been ill for a long time, and like many villagers, she did not go to the hospital. Her son-in-law did not fail here. He helped with the funeral, did everything by himself, because it was almost time for his wife to go to the maternity hospital. In fact, 40 days before the mother's death, Amanda was already taken to the maternity hospital in the district center, because it turned out that her pregnancy was complicated. Multiple pregnancies. There she soon gave birth to twins. This event was not the last one, because twins were not born in the village every year. That is why the young parents were congratulated, rejoiced, wished all the best. And everyone tried to do something to help, to give something nice and useful, not spared. After all, the mother kept the twins, gave birth. Tried to manage 2 children without mother's help. True, Oliver did not refuse, took care of the girls, loved his family. To all appearances, everyone could see that. I go out in the morning and he's hanging nappies in the yard. Everyone would have such a husband, said the nearest neighbor of the young. And so it was like that for a year and a half. No one could say anything bad about this family. True, those who were in closer contact with Oliver hinted that he dreamed of going to the city, and even had some thoughts about what he would do there. But there was no talk of him leaving his wife and children here. So Amanda was again to be envied. The city would be urban, and the girls would grow up in the city too. Oliver really had such plans to go to the city and open a veterinary clinic there. Actually, he thought about it while studying at the institute. He did not abandon these plans, and even prepared the ground for leaving the village. Why did he move? Because he was not a city person from the beginning. He was born and lived in the same village, in a different neighborhood, of course. And his life there was not very good. His parents drank, respectively, and life was worse than ever. He rushed to the city to escape from them as soon as possible. In the city, he lived in a hostel, and after graduation, where to go? Only to rent a flat, spending all the money he never had. And where will he get the money from if he's just starting to work? And if he can find a job? So he went to the village, firstly, to save money, and secondly, to wait until the man who promised him assistance would retire. He had a distant relative, a lonely and somewhat strange man, but practical. He had his own small veterinary office, which he promised to give to the lad after he had gained experience. And so he had worked with animals for almost 3 years. The experience had been gained. The relative was about to retire. But now there was an obstacle to the fulfillment of this dream, namely his wife and daughters. The evil tongues were right. This marriage was accidental. Oliver and Amanda hadn't even met. They'd just seen each other a few times, and it had been a whirlwind. What was there to do? He was a young and lonely man, and just after graduating from college, he had split up with the girl he loved. That, Oliver realized, was to be expected. That girl, a fellow student, was not going to go to any village and wait for her lover to go to the mountain. Nor was she going to. Why should she? She had big plans and every chance of realizing them. And indeed, she had married before she graduated. Oliver was upset about it, and he didn't really care who was going to be around after his beloved Vanessa. He didn't even get a good look at Amanda, but she was pretty quiet, friendly. They met occasionally. Oliver had no plans for her. And then she comes in crying, pregnant. That's how they got married. He's not a scoundrel to abandon a pregnant girl. Of course, he would have left Amanda, even without much regret. But the daughters, Vanessa and Elsa, Amanda insisted that one of the daughters was called Elsa in honor of her mother, who died a month before the birth of her granddaughters. Oliver was against it. Well, who names a girl Elsa these days? What kind of name is that? If she had called her Stephanie, it would have been a collective farm. Indeed, this name seemed to him too simple, rustic. He never even called his wife Emmy, only Amanda. But then Amanda, usually pliant, looking up at him, suddenly snapped at him. I'd call her Stephanie if that was my mum's name. Besides, aren't we in the country? And so she did. One girl was named Vanessa, in honor of that unfulfilled love. Amanda never found out, of course. And the other became Elsa, in honor of her grandmother, who had worked in the collective farm all her life, and lost all her health on hard work, and lived to be just over 40. It was necessary to think of naming one's own daughter after a person with such a difficult fate. Because of that, Oliver had no love for one of his daughters. All hope was pinned on Vanessa. Maybe she would have a much better, happier fate. The girls were not twins, but twins. That is, they were not even identical. They resembled each other like sisters, but no more. Elsa, in everyone's opinion, was like her mother, light, smiling, blue-eyed. But Vanessa was born not like her mother, but not like her father either, with dark hair and brown eyes, and one eye was obviously darker than the other. That is an interesting girl with a twist, not like all the other children. When the girls learnt to walk, this difference became even more noticeable. Elsa, calm, cheerful, ran tumbling on her slightly crooked legs, and all the time sang, or rather, mumbled some melody in her infantile language. Vanessa was quicker, skinnier, and didn't reach out to strangers. That was the reason why all the villagers always liked Elsa better. Whenever they saw her, everyone would stop and start fussing over the child. "Oh, you're our bright little one. What a grandmother's granddaughter you are. That's a good thing your mum called you Elsa. We'll have Elsa again in our village." Vanessa, of course, was also noticed, but in passing. "And I see that Daddy's assistant is growing up. Why are you running away? Don't be afraid. No one will touch you." But Vanessa didn't go to anyone. For some reason, everyone recognized her as Daddy's daughter. Maybe because they'd noticed that Oliver treated her better. And that's why they weren't particularly surprised when they talked about divorce and found out that Oliver would leave the village not alone, but would take only one daughter. Of course, Amanda was the first to know about it when the girls were a year and a half old and it was time to put them in kindergarten, and she had to go to work on the farm. He immediately told her that he saw no point in their future life together. We need to get a divorce so that we don't have to suffer with alimony. Let's divide the children. Vanessa I'll take with me, and Elsa let her stay with you. Amanda was amazed at the very idea of divorce, although she felt that something had gone wrong in their life together. And then it turned out that her husband was going to take their daughter away. And she knew that Oliver did not throw words to the wind, decided, so will do. But at first the thought of possible separation from Vanessa had frightened her so much that she hadn't thought about divorce. "What are you talking about?" she said indignantly. "Where is it seen that children are to be divided? I'm not giving up my daughter. And I'm not going to ask you. You think how you're going to be alone with 2 children. If you think I'll give up my divorce for that, you're wrong. I won't. I'll take my daughter, and you'll still be alone with the second one, and nobody owes anybody anything. And stop it, please. There's nothing terrible about what happened. I married you by accident. It was a mistake. And now I'm going to make up for that mistake." Amanda both cried and resisted as best she could, but what exactly could she do? On the one hand, Oliver seemed to be right. It would be harder for her with 2 daughters, and she really loved Elsa, not that she loved her more, but in a different way, not like Vanessa, and the girl was more attached to her. After all, Vanessa was indeed paternal. For the village, of course, this story became too much. Well, okay, people divorce, the husband goes to the city, so many people foresaw it, and now they had an excuse to say, "Well, we told you so, but to share the children. No, this has never been heard of here before. One child is taken away by his father, the other stays with his mother. It seems fair, but for a mother to give up her child, what kind of justice is that? The other daughter will stay with her." But we have not seen such stories in the village that a woman, even if she has many children, would give away one of 10 children somewhere on the side. No, this is something completely abnormal. It should not be. Even at the village council, the chairman said to Oliver, "Why do you leave Amanda here? Why don't you take her to town?" "We're divorced, in case you haven't noticed," Oliver replied defiantly. "Well, good, but why separate the children? That's no way to do business, especially since they're twins. Firstly, they're not twins, they're twins. That's a big difference. And secondly, what would be better if I left Amanda here with 2 kids? And naturally, we'll still see each other, and the girls will see each other. I'll still come here. And we're not talking about someone leaving anyone. We are divorced. It happens to people all the time." And he looked meaningfully at the chairman, who, incidentally, was also married for the 2nd time. Hearing Oliver's reply, he sighed and agreed. "Well, your business, of course." Soon, Oliver packed up and left. Amanda had cried all her tears about the divorce even before that. But parting with her daughter, she couldn't stand it. She cried like a country girl. Looking at her mother, Elsa roared, reached out to her father and sister, but they paid no attention. Whether it was her father's influence, or whether she herself was so indifferent to her home, to her mother and sister. Vanessa didn't even look back at the places she was leaving. Maybe it's right that she's being taken away. People started talking. She's kind of soulless, just like a wolf cub. Well, I don't speak ill of the child. She doesn't realize where they're taking her, and probably thinks they'll bring her back tomorrow. Others disagreed. Amanda is hard to understand anyway. Who'd have thought she'd be such a cuckoo? But why cuckoo? She's got her other daughter with her. Would you be willing to give one of them away to some unknown place? That's just it. But why unknown where? She's going with her father. She's going to be a city girl. I guess that's her fate. She's not from around here. Anyway. Many people's opinion of Amanda changed for the worse at first. Indeed, not everyone would agree to give up their child. Maybe it was also because Amanda herself felt either guilty or just hard to deal with everything that had happened. Her husband left, took her daughter away, and she sort of gave her back. So from then on she walked around as if she had been drowned in water, never looked up at people, as if she was ashamed of what had happened in her life because of her own crying eyes. But time passed, the story was forgotten. Other events took place in the village, and people no longer mentioned every time that Amanda had abandoned her daughter, that her husband had left her. This is what happens in life, so why keep reminding the unhappy woman who was already suffering? Especially since her ex-husband apparently had a great life. He really managed to become the owner of a veterinary office, at first located in a one-room flat, where he lived with his daughter. The little girl gave her to a kindergarten, the most ordinary, and he himself worked, trying to improve his situation, at first quite unenviable. A year later, he and his daughter came to the village to his ex-wife with their own car, a rather shabby, but still a foreign car, which was a novelty for the village, and proved that Oliver was not lost, and still in a lot up, and his daughter Vanessa was in good order. Elsa, of course, was not neglected, but she had a simpler dress and fewer toys. The girls themselves, who were not even 3 years old yet, didn't seem to care at all, but people noticed, and of course again began to discuss how lucky Vanessa was. Nobody called Elsa unhappy. What's the big deal? She lives with her mother. Her mother works, takes care of her daughter, and loves her. Oliver didn't stay with his relatives for long, and it was obvious that he didn't come without any particular desire, as if he were passing through. He'd only been here for a day. Amanda, seeing him off, cried she felt sorry for her daughter, whom she hadn't seen for a year, and asked him to come more often. But there was no more often. A businessman had no time to travel. And the next time he came only a few years later, when the girls were already going to school. True, Amanda herself went to the city a couple of times to visit her ex-husband, to look at Vanessa. But she didn't talk much about these visits, saying that everything was fine there. Everyone was healthy. Vanessa was in kindergarten, and Oliver was working. He hadn't married yet, and wasn't going to. She was reluctant to talk about it, and she was not so cheerful when she came back from the guests. Apparently it was a chilly welcome. But rumors were rife, so the villagers knew that Oliver was really doing well, and had more than one small office, and that the matter was much more serious, but nobody knew anything for sure. True, it was noted that Amanda had gone there with a sack of village gifts, and returned with one doll for her daughter. Didn't she buy it herself? Of course you expect gifts from these businessmen, if they would die for a penny. You yourself would probably eat her buttered chickens for the love of it, people speculated. They learnt very little when Oliver arrived with his girlfriend and daughter. He had a bigger, more expensive, newer foreign car. He looked more respectable himself, and his daughter was dressed up like a doll. Amanda was, of course, happy for her daughter, who had a much wider smile of happiness than Elsa. It was a shame for Elsa, and Vanessa had become much more of a stranger. Elsa met her sister much more welcoming, pleased with her, wanted to talk about something. But Vanessa looked at her sister's toys and her preparations for school with feigned bewilderment. Is that what you're going to do with that backpack? That's a waste. They don't wear those nowadays. I have a much more interesting one. It's a pity I didn't bring it. I would have shown you how to do it. Have you got your school uniform yet? A backpack is just like a backpack. Many of us have them. Only the color is different. And we don't have uniforms at school. It just says what is definitely not allowed. That's all, Elsa answered, offended by her sister's inattention and words. And the one did not think to stop with adult contempt. Well, yes, in the village, of course, everything is simpler than in our town. If you go out in a dress like yours, people will laugh. And Mum doesn't dress well at all. I can see why Daddy didn't want to live with her. He has acquaintances now. You know what they are like. Just like in the cinema. Elsa took offense, but Vanessa continued. As a result, no communication between the sisters was not possible, which made their mother very sad, and she was even glad that they came for a short time. After their departure, it turned out that Elsa, too, was pleased with the departure of her father, whom she did not call in any way, and did not want to communicate with him at all. It's good that they've gone, isn't it, Mum? She said afterwards, except don't lie. What are you saying? It's your sister. You're not used to Dad, obviously, and he's a stranger to you. But Vanessa is the one you need to talk to. You're adults. You'll be going to school soon. You can write to each other. Talk on the phone. I mean, it's really nice to have a sibling. Yeah, but she's so imaginative, and I don't want to talk to her. I'd rather she didn't come. She's been saying all sorts of nasty things about how we dress differently, and our house isn't like this. Well, it's understandable. She's not used to this kind of life. You saw that they have a flat with all the comforts, didn't you? Of course, she doesn't like it here very much. So let her stay with her own comforts, Elsa replied. She would like to be friends with her sister, and she was not averse to being proud of her father, who has such a car, such a suit, and he himself is also representative. But it was very disrespectful to talk about her mother in her home, and for her there was no one and nothing better. The communication between the former spouses, however, soon came to nothing. Oliver did not really want to come, they had no time to travel, so there were almost no meetings. Amanda realized that, most likely, her ex-husband had found another wife, and she had probably become a mother to Vanessa. It hurt to think about it, but what could be done? She could only be glad that she had another daughter, Elsa. In general, life went on and on, past offenses forgotten under the weight of daily problems. Oliver gave less and less information about himself and his daughter. Amanda had taught herself that it was for the best. If they're not talking, they're doing fine. Isn't it? They probably are. And then she married a local man, a tractor driver. He was also divorced. His wife ran away to town, like someone was luring her, and Bill was expecting her to come back for a while. But it turned out that she wasn't. She wasn't going to come back, and was living in the city with her new husband, to whom she had already had 2 children. That's when he suggested, "And do not start a life together. Why live alone?" We got together, got married. We lived, in general, quite well for a few years. They didn't talk about love, but they lived in harmony. Bill treated her and Elsa well. That is, it could be said that a few years after the divorce, the woman was still lucky. Oliver, when he learnt about it, said that since it was so, he would not come here anymore, and he was not going to bring Vanessa to this nest of debauchery either. Apparently he was hurt that his Amanda had found her happiness. She just waved her hand. It was a pity that Elsa had lost all ties with her sister. It was no good. But the girl was not upset, because she was embarrassed by these meetings with her sister, who the further she went, the more she boasted of her good city life, her outfits, and so on. On the last visit of her relatives, Elsa even left home. Told her mom she would stay at her friend's house for the time being. But what about it? What am I going to tell my father? Amanda was upset. Whatever you want to say. Tell him I've gone to a holiday resort, replied Elsa. Amanda, of course, did not lie like that. She said that her daughter was in a pioneer camp and threw the photo from the real resort, which Vanessa had exhibited, into the oven. There was no need to upset Elsa once again, though she hoped, of course, that someday the sisters would reconcile and be truly kindred people. What can one do if their lives are so different? That's why for a long time she knew nothing about Vanessa. Elsa, having finished school, left for the district center. Mother does not stay alone, but with her husband. Let them live together in peace. And she, Elsa, decided to get some other speciality. She was not going to become a milkmaid. Amanda herself discouraged her from it. She knew how hard such work was, and things in the collective farm were not very good, so it was not sure that this farm would last long. Elsa decided to study to become a kindergarten teacher and enrolled in a pedagogical school. There was no dormitory, she had to rent a room, and at weekends she often came home to visit her mother. But fate was still not spared, only she had arranged her personal life with Bill, as he died in a fire at the tractor station. She was devastated, her heart began to ache, her blood pressure was skyrocketing. She could hardly work. She had to transfer from milkmaid to the office as a bookkeeper. Elsa understood that it was very difficult for her mum, so she decided to return to the village. And don't make things up, my daughter. How will you come back without finishing your studies? You'll remain without education, Amanda discouraged her. It's okay, people live without education, she reassured her daughter. In fact, she decided to return not only because of her mother. She started a romance in the district center, but nothing happened there. The man whom she already considered her fiancé, Elsa, abandoned and went to another, who probably had more tempting prospects. She hadn't told her mother about it, but Amanda herself guessed it all from her daughter's unhappy look. And what is it? She thought sometimes, listening at night to Elsa sobbing in her room. The daughter has the same fate as me. It will seem that I, because of my mother, received no education, and so will she. But also in her private life, from the looks of it, nothing good is going to happen. I wonder how Vanessa's doing. She's probably doing fine. If she was bad, she'd come to her mother to complain. Or does she no longer consider me a mother? Such thoughts made her aching heart even more distressed. But she hid the deterioration of her health, did not tell her daughter anything. And one morning she just didn't wake up. Her torn heart had stopped. Oliver at the funeral of his ex-wife did not come, referring to the busyness. And Vanessa came alone. But everyone around her had the impression that she came not so much to say goodbye to her mother, as just to show off in front of her fellow villagers. The girl, already a student of the institute, drove up to the gate of her native house in her own car. She got out, stood there, as if not knowing what to do next, and giving everyone an opportunity to examine herself. She really looked splendid, in a little black dress that emphasized her chiseled figure, with modestly combed dark hair, pale with a tragic expression on her face and a lace handkerchief clasped in her hand. She took a large bouquet of burgundy roses out of the car. She walked slowly into the house, where an open coffin stood on a stool. She came over and bent over the face of the deceased, and all present at this scene speculated for a long time afterwards. Had she even touched her mother's forehead with her lips? No, she didn't even think about it. And as her lips were painted, even at the funeral she couldn't resist. It's not for us to judge her. She hasn't even seen her mother in years. Others tried to justify her. Those who hadn't seen the squeamish grimace Vanessa couldn't hide. Straightening up, she quickly came to her senses, put her handkerchief to her face, and turned to her bitterly weeping sister. "Here we are, you and I alone, without Mum," she exclaimed sadly, lightly putting her arm around her sister's shoulders and kissing the air picturesquely a few centimeters from Elsa's face swollen with tears. Her sister saw the falsity and pulled away slightly, but said nothing, only stroked Vanessa's shoulder. She was not at all interested in the feelings of this well-groomed girl, who happened to be her own sister. Now the difference between the girls was enormous, and they could not be taken for sisters, just two young people from completely different worlds. Having flaunted herself and cried at the cemetery and sat at the table with everyone, Vanessa didn't know what to do. She was tired of playing the grief-stricken daughter, and what else to do in the village just could not imagine. It was inconvenient to leave at once, and she did not want to grieve further, and to be in some wilderness among strangers who do not so much admire her as to remember the deceased. It was just uncomfortable. But from the institute on the eve of the session, she asked off just for the funeral of her mother, so she turned right at the memorial table to the chairman, who was also present at the wake. "You as an official can give me a certificate or a copy of the death certificate. I need to present it to the institute, or they won't believe it." "Yes, of course," said the chairman. "And by the way, as an official, I'll tell you at once, girls, it's sort of early now, but since one of the sisters is leaving soon, you'd better find out at once, or you'll agree how you're going to live here. Did your mother leave a will?" Elsa was a little moved by this message. She was exhausted by the funeral, had shed many tears, and knew very well that there was nothing to bequeath to her mother. She thought that Mum had just left some kind of letter to address them. But Vanessa, who knew nothing about her mother's condition, was wary, of course. Here were her village relatives living practically in poverty, from her point of view. But how to know? Maybe her mother was saving up something. Or did she have some inherited good jewelry, gold coins? She must have left most of it to her sister, but she should have something too. She was her own blood after all. And the chairman took a leaf out of his pocket and read, "You understand she had no great wealth, and she was not legally savvy. She wrote as best she could. And here is what she wrote. I bequeath all movable property, things and a cow to my daughter Elsa, an immovable property, a house, and a plot of land in the village of Vozvizenka to my second daughter, Vanessa. So here, girls, see for yourselves how you will deal with it now. That is, you, Vanessa, can move here. You can do something else. And you, Elsa, have everything in the house, plus the cow. The sisters sat with their mouths open. Both were somewhat disappointed. Vanessa was disappointed that her mother had no wealth, and Elsa could not understand what her mother had done. Where would she go now with this cow, which had been limping on one leg lately? Of course, the cow is very good, quite young, nothing to say, and this leg most likely can be healed. But where will she live? In an empty field with this cow. The guests were also perplexed by this last will of the deceased. They dispersed, and the girls were left alone. What a trick her mother pulled. I don't know about you, but I didn't expect it at all. I'm a landlady now, Vanessa grinned. I guess you are. Are you going to kick me out? Elsa also asked with a chuckle. I don't make it up. Why would I need this wreck? Especially since you'll have nowhere to live. This house, even if you sell it, you won't have enough money for petrol to get to your village. Live like you've been living, and come and visit sometime. Relatives, after all. Vanessa, who was rather amused by the announcement of this will, left. Elsa was left alone. She looked at her mother's portrait with the black ribbon and couldn't understand why her mother had done that. Perhaps you hoped in this way that my sister and I would become closer to each other. Oh, Mum, how ridiculous is that? It was just ridiculous to think of Vanessa coming and living in our house. I'm certainly not afraid that she'll decide to kick me out and, say, sell the house, though she's probably wrong about its value. I'm more afraid of my father, no matter what you say. And he's a greedy man, and even a little money can be very tempting to him. And who knows? What if he wants to dispose of this unfortunate dwelling in his own way? No, he probably won't. But still. Or did you want to make it up to Vanessa with that will? I mean, you always seem to feel guilty about giving one of us away. Well, that's wrong too. It's not your fault. I hope you didn't mean to hurt me either and hope my sister wouldn't leave me homeless. But that's pretty much what happened. Vanessa just laughed at your will. And then she left. And I kind of kept my interest in my cow. Oh, the cow's got to be sorted out too. What's wrong with her leg? A cow for any mistress is not just an animal. She becomes a native being, a nurse, a conversationalist. That's why Elsa was not going to leave her and her mother Vesna, a white cow with red spots. After all, it was she who had such a growth on her neck after her mother's death, and the cow seemed to sympathize with her sincerely. And now she had hurt her leg. And Elsa herself, of course, could not understand what had happened. She should have called a vet. She remembered her father again. He was busy. He couldn't come to his wife's funeral. But maybe he could have looked at Vesna's leg at the same time. Though it is unlikely, he treats pedigree dogs and cats in the city, but he doesn't remember how to approach a cow. There was a veterinarian in their village who had been working after my father for many years, an experienced man who knew cattle well. But now he was away, treating animals in some distant villages. When he returned, Elsa turned to him, and the vet did not refuse. He came, examined her, said the cow had hurt her hoof. He dealt with it quite easily. He washed the sore limb, applied a bandage with some ointment, and very soon the cow was fine. And not just fine, soon Vesna became a real breadwinner. Elsa never went to work on the farm. She hoped that someday she would finish her studies and get a profession. But until that happened, she needed something to live on. Elsa decided to live by subsistence farming. She had a good vegetable garden, chickens, and the cow got well. She became very good again. So Elsa started to go to the motorway to sell milk and other products. She needed money to continue her studies, but also to repair the house, because it was still strong, but it needed repair. And she couldn't do it on her own. The business of selling milk, butter, and sour cream went well. People appreciated her conscientiousness and the quality of her products and began to come to her house. Elsa rejoiced at her success and hoped that she would soon raise the necessary amount of money. One day, when she was standing on the motorway, a man in an expensive car stopped near her. He approached her, took aim, and decided to buy everything he had at once. "Why do you want so much at once? You'd better come here more often." I stand here almost every day, and I can give you the address. Come straight to the house." Elsa was pleased. "Well, that's an option too. Do you have anything else besides milk?" "I'm not just for myself, I have workers, so I try to feed them well. In the shops, it's more expensive, and you can never be sure of the quality. I have everything that grows in the vegetable garden: potatoes, cucumbers, and other vegetables of all kinds. I have pickles. By the way, I'll gladly sell you some if you need it. I still have some left." "No, it's all good, don't think so. It's just that I'm used to doing a lot of it alone. You can't eat it all." "How do you manage such a household, living alone?" "No husband, no brother." "No," the man wondered. "It's the way I'm used to it. We're country people. We live and work that way. It's not that hard. I used to live with my mom. Now I'm alone. I have a sister, but she lives in the city." Elsa wondered why she was talking to a complete stranger. But somehow he had a way with her. And to be honest, she liked him. She was glad when he took the address and soon came to buy groceries from her and talk to her again. Turns out he's single too. True, he has a small daughter, but his wife is gone. She left, leaving him with the baby. And he himself has a small but very successful business, which he is also engaged in, as used to alone. That's how their relationship began. Meetings started, and love flared up. "Elsa, how long are we going to meet like this, like schoolboys? Let's move to my place in the city. Let's get married and live as a family," Andrew once suggested to her. "Wow, let's get married right away," she smiled. "No, I have nothing against it, of course. It's just kind of unexpected. And I don't want to move to the city either. Forgive me. I tried to live there, but I didn't like it. And now I have a household, a cow I can't leave for one day. I have no one to leave it with. You'd better come to my place with your daughter. We'll get acquainted. You'll have a rest. Take a walk in the fresh air. Look how nice it is here. What city can replace that?" Andrew agreed, though he hadn't thought about moving to the village yet. He had things to do in the city, too, and had no one to leave them to. And it had to happen that on the day Andrew and his daughter Kelly arrived in the village, Vanessa showed up. She needed some documents, so she decided to visit her sister. Elsa was happy to have so many people in her house for once. She set the table, talked to the little girl, asked her sister how she was doing in the city. And suddenly she realized that no one was really listening to her, because Andrew and Vanessa were having a different conversation, and they communicate not with words, but with looks, smiles, and fleeting touches. And they understand each other perfectly. Vanessa, always so disgruntled and gloomy when she arrived in the village, was unrecognizable. She was cheerful, lively, her eyes shining. It didn't take any discernment to realize that she was trying to impress the man she liked, and not just to impress, but to arouse in him stronger feelings. Elsa realized that, and when Andrew came out, she asked her sister bluntly, "I take it you liked him." "Why wouldn't I? Or do you really want him?" The sister replied defiantly. "But actually, he and I are already in a relationship." "That's sad," Elsa said. "Sister, judge for yourself. Why would you want him? You live in the country, he's in the city. Well, you're not going to move in with each other, I take it. You're not going to visit each other all your lives. He has a daughter, by the way. She needs her mother. I know what it's like to live without a mother, even with the most loving father. And you're just going to stay Aunt Elsa? No. If you're serious about him, I won't get in the way. It just seemed to me that you were just having fun like that." "What fun? You haven't forgotten that we're 25 soon. My father's been hinting to me for a long time that it's time to get married, and I don't really mind. And this is quite an option." And Elsa decided not to waste time on useless clarification of relations. When Vanessa with Andrew and Kelly left at the same time, she did not delay and reproach anyone, and even showed how painful it was. Maybe this man would indeed make up her own sister's happiness. And if so, why should she get in their way? And Vanessa really had the most serious plans. When she arrived in town, she immediately invited Andrew home and introduced him to her father. Oliver, having learnt through his channels about the business of his daughter's new friend, immediately told her, "Well, look, you have a serious man. He is not just a business, he is the director of the bank. And it's high time you got married. How long are you going to be a girl? You'll finally get off my neck, and I'll be able to live in peace." "Oh, Dad, tell me, when have I ever stopped you from living?" Vanessa was indignant. But, having secured the support of his father, began to give Andrew more and more confidently to understand that she is very much not against becoming his wife, and soon she was able to tell her sister that her wedding was coming up. Elsa, of course, was happy for her sister, but she cried a little about herself, but not much. After all, she could not be said to be so seriously in love with Andrew. It was just that he seemed to her a reliable, decent man to live with. And suddenly, but she sighed as her mother had once sighed, "What can you do?" So it was fate. But it turned out that her fleeting romance was not without a trace. Soon after she learned of her sister's impending wedding, she realized she was pregnant. That could have changed the case. But Elsa decided she would stay out of it. She refused to go to the wedding and decided not to tell Andrew or Vanessa anything. She decided she'd be a single mom, that's all. Not a bad option either, she wouldn't be living alone after all. After all, her mom raised her without any help. She and the baby won't be lost. Yes, she never got an education, she has no reliable profession that gives a stable income, but she is young, healthy, and already loves her child. It was impossible to hide from her fellow villagers the fact that she was not married and was expecting a baby. Rumors started to spread. "Here you are. Such a modest, decent. What have you done?" shook their heads neighbors. As she was left without a mother, so she went, standing on the motorway. I knew it wouldn't end well. Where is it seen that a young, beautiful girl stands selling groceries? It's more like a woman's face. Someone must have cheated her. This relationship with those who go out with the right and left. He's one of those. But as the years go by, they don't marry. At least she'll have a child now. How will she manage on her own? If only her father or sister could help her. Keep your pocket wide open. You don't see that father around here anymore. He hasn't helped the little girl either. He'd come once a year, slip in a penny, and that's all the help he needed. And now he's probably forgotten her name. He didn't even come to bury his wife. And what to say about his sister? Have we seen that sister? And Elsa herself did not hope for any relatives. She felt no particular resentment towards her sister because of Andrew. Firstly, they knew nothing. And secondly, Vanessa, her own sister, and she wished her only happiness. And since she decided to handle it on her own, that was the way to do it. And she continued to go to the motorway with her groceries, diligently saving money. Now it was no longer for her studies, but for her child's upbringing. However, it was getting harder every day. The pregnancy was making itself felt. She didn't go to her sister's wedding, but she received a parcel in which Vanessa sent photos from her gorgeous wedding and a gift for reconciliation, a beautiful jumper. Elsa responded with a cheerful congratulations and thanked for the present, which in the current situation could not even try on. Admired the beauty of the bride and groom almost sincerely, she was not envious. And since she had decided not to be angry with her sister, she wasn't. Everyone has their own destiny, after all. One evening, as she was walking home after milking the cow, she was stopped by a man's voice. "Let me have some milk." Elsa looked round in surprise and froze, putting the pail of milk on the ground. A rather scary-looking man was looking at her from behind a lilac bush. He was dressed in some tattered cotton box, his face maybe and not scary in normal condition. But now, overgrown with a beard almost to his eyes, it was frightening. She became so uncomfortable that she couldn't even scream. "Who are you, excuse me?" she asked in a half-whisper. "Just saw you coming. Smelled the milk, too." Couldn't resist. "Sorry if I scared you." He saw Elsa's big belly and was probably really ashamed that he had scared her. "Who the hell are you?" Already a little calmer, Elsa asked. "Would you like to buy milk?" "I'd buy a lot of things. Not on a budget right now," the man grinned. And Elsa said, unexpectedly to herself, "Let's go into the house. I'll pour you a mug there," and went up on the porch, perplexed. Who am I taking into the house? Bad head. He's a real bandit. The child in her belly stirred. either frightened or approving of her actions. In the house she did pour the stranger a large mug of milk, cut off a piece of cabbage pie. "Help yourself. Who are you? You never told me." But the man ate and drank greedily. It was obvious he was hungry, and Elsa got cold feet again. "Don't be afraid," said the guest at last. "I don't hurt anyone, and I'm not a bandit at all. Though, to be honest, I escaped from prison." She sank down on the stool like that, dumbfounded by this confession. "Well, thank you, I'm relieved," was all Elsa could mutter. "Don't be afraid," the man reassured her again. "I'm not a gangster, honestly, and I wasn't in jail for robbery or murder. I just didn't have the strength to be there. That's one. And two, this is the only way I can prove my innocence. And by the way, I still have a little daughter. At least for her sake, I have to do my best. Do you live alone?" How could I live alone when there's a lot of people around? Some of the neighbors must have seen you by now. And when they've seen you, they've drawn their own conclusions. You don't look like a heroic lover. So, most likely, someone has already run for the police officer. Elsa's voice was trembling, but she still tried not to show her fear, and on the contrary, to show this man that she was not going to become an easy prey. "I hope you won't give me away," he said. "But even if I don't, are you going to live here all your life with me, or run around somewhere?" "I've already said, I need to find proof of my innocence. There is such proof. Only I have to get to town. And me, you see," he pointed with his hand at his clothes. "All this is touching, of course. Only I haven't got men's clothes or a razor to make you look human. I don't even have the money to dress you decently either. I understand and I don't ask, but at least let me stay with you tonight. Honestly, I'm exhausted." Elsa saw how tired the man was and made a bed for him in the far room, that is, in a small pantry where all sorts of junk was usually kept. She sat down and thought. It could not be said that she believed this stranger so much. That is, that he had escaped from prison. She did, for the prison was not so far from their village. Prisoners had escaped in the past. Now one of them had stumbled upon her. And of course he's the innocent victim, looking to prove a point. That was hard to believe. Elsa knew, ask any prisoner, and he would say that he was in prison because of the intrigues of some ill-wishers. Well, however, she's not a judge or an investigator. She invited a man in, fed him, put him to bed. One can only hope she doesn't stab him. Otherwise. So she finished all her evening chores without much worry and went to bed. In the morning, the neighborhood policeman still came to see her, but not because someone had reported about the visitor, but just went and questioned everyone. The news about the escaped prisoner had already reached their station. "Hello, Elsa. Grief has come upon our village, as they say. An escaped convict is somewhere in our neighborhood, I am not mistaken. Have you seen any strangers lately?" he asked. "No, I haven't seen any," replied Elsa calmly. "I've been minding my own business, no time to look at either acquaintances or strangers." "That's good, of course. But look, it's no joke. There's a fugitive bandit loose somewhere in our neighborhood. So don't go out much in the evening, and don't go out early in the morning," warned the neighborhood policeman. "I have my cows to milk," she grinned. That was the end of the conversation. It was difficult to suspect the girl of harboring an escaped prisoner. The policeman did not think of examining her home. When she entered the house, she saw her guest standing in the doorway with a painfully tense face. He had heard the whole conversation and realized that Elsa had no intention of giving him away. "Thank you. We haven't even met, by the way. My name is James." "Nice to meet you. I'm Elsa," she replied. "You don't worry, Elsa. I'll be gone soon. Is that policeman of yours going to be around the village for long?" "I'm sorry, I didn't ask, but I think a long time. I mean, he's going round interviewing everyone. Who's seen who, who's talked to who. What I said you heard, but with others it may be longer. There are such amateurs, how they will start to tell where they saw something suspicious. I hope, if anyone saw our acquaintance, I won't be judged too severely for concealment." "No, of course not. I'll say I threatened you with a weapon of some kind. Really, I have nothing." "All right, stay with me a little longer. What can I do? Maybe he'll be gone by evening." It'll be dark then. In the meantime, at least get some rest, get some sleep. How long are you going to run? As long as it takes. Maybe you could give me some scissors too. I'll at least trim my beard. So the fugitive stayed at Elsa's house. She had not only scissors, but even some old razor. And he got rid of his beard without cutting himself and turned out to be quite a young man. Elsa decided not to go anywhere, stayed with her guest for the time being. And what were the two of them to do? Only talk. The girl told why she lived alone, and he about how he found himself in such a position. I was actually doing business, but also interfered with someone. That is, I know perfectly well to whom, and there is evidence of my non-involvement. But it is necessary to get to them. I hid my documents in the city in a locker. No one can touch them there. I don't want to go back to prison, especially since they'll add time to my sentence for escape. But if you have proof, you can take it out of your stash and show it to the investigators. That's easy for me to say. I doubt very much I'll be allowed to do that. I'm planning to fight some pretty serious mates. I've got to get out. Not even for my own sake. If I were alone, I'd do my time. But I have a daughter, only 5 years old. She's an orphan. My wife died in childbirth and I have no relatives. So they put her in an orphanage. What about her now? I just don't know. If I can justify myself, I'll find her, of course, and take her away. And if I stayed in jail, I'd be out only in 5 years, and even then under the most favorable circumstances. So my daughter would be 10 years old by now. And I don't know if she'd recognize me and forgive me. James stayed with Elsa that day and the next, and she saw that the policeman continued to walk around the village. Some more policemen had arrived. Could it be that someone had actually seen the fugitive here? It was simply dangerous for him to go out now. Their long conversations made her not only sympathize with the man in trouble, but also believe that he wasn't lying. She would have been glad to help, but she was in such a position herself that it was simply difficult to make unnecessary movements. Still, when James couldn't go outside on the third day either, Elsa made up her mind. I'll tell you what, you can't hide like this for long anyway. Let's do it this way. I'll go to town. Get your papers, and then you can do what you need to do with them. And isn't that going to be too hard for you? James asked, looking at her large belly. Time permitting for now. I hope I don't give birth on the way, Elsa assured him. And she did indeed drive into town without difficulty, picked up her file folder in the luggage room, and headed home. But when she arrived, she didn't find James there. It turned out that he had been taken away. A neighbor had informed her of this. Oh, Elsa, where are you walking? You have no idea what was here. The police were walking around our village, and they found the fugitive. And do you know where? In your yard. What nonsense. I had no one there. I was at home all the time. I only left yesterday. I had to go to town. You see, to get the papers, Elsa froze with horror. Well, and yesterday he saw that the yard was empty, and he crawled into a shed somewhere like he was hiding. He's been wandering around the house too. Mrs. Jenny came to milk your freckles, and she saw a strange man step into the barn, and the neighborhood officer had warned everyone. But why are you turning green? You had nothing to do with it. You weren't there. Go into the house, see if he's done anything wrong. They'll come to you, of course, and ask you what's going on. Was he not killed at least? Elsa asked, really pale with fear for her acquaintance. No, he's alive, he surrendered quietly. There was no shooting, no blood. Don't worry. The cops came, put his hands behind his back and into the car. So your house didn't seem to be damaged. There were no dead people there for sure. The police did come round, said they had arrested the man who had broken into her house, asked her if anything was missing. Of course, nothing was missing. Left alone, Elsa closed the door, sat down by the table, and thought about what she should do now. She really wanted to help this man. It was good that she had the documents in hand. But was there any point in taking them to the police? Wouldn't that do more harm than good? She opened James's folder and began to read, increasingly horrified and bewildered by how complicated everything in life was. It turned out that James had been set up by Andrew, the same banker who had fathered her child and was now her sister's husband. If she goes to the police, she will unwittingly hurt Vanessa, and her, Elsina's, actions could be interpreted as revenge. But she cannot go, because she now knows the truth and must help James, who trusted her. The case was sent for review, and soon James was released, and Andrew was detained. During all these proceedings, Elsa managed to give birth to a baby boy. Vanessa was left alone, but survived it quite easily, because her father was rich, and she never fell in love with Andrew. You could think about settling a new personal life, and she immediately filed for divorce. Kelly turned out to be James' daughter. Andrew took her from the orphanage and deceived her into guardianship, hoping in case of anything to get the inheritance. Vanessa was indifferent to children and gave the girl with visible relief. She and the news that Elsa had a son, that is, her nephew, took without interest. Several years passed after all these events. James, acquitted, rid of all false accusations, immediately returned to Elsa. It turned out not just to thank her for saving him. He confessed that he had fallen in love with her. "But I have a child with your enemy, by the way. And there's still no telling what will happen when this Andrew guy gets free. And what might be. I'll adopt the child, that's all. I have a daughter too, by the way. Don't forget that. I do know her, don't I? Kelly and I became friends when she came round. And I hope it doesn't freak you out that I have a kid. See, why should your son be an obstacle for me? Wait a minute, though. I haven't asked the most important thing. Do you agree to be my wife?" Elsa agreed. She, too, had realized that she was attracted to this man when he came to her house. Soon they were married. He adopted a child, and Elsa adopted his daughter. James took back the bank, convinced his wife that she needed to move to the city, to use her maternity leave to get an education. Think what it would be like. A banker's wife living in the countryside, tending cattle and selling milk on the motorway, he said. And Elsa agreed after all. Indeed, at least for the sake of children, she should have changed her life. But only the house is a pity. I cannot sell it. After all, according to the documents, it belongs to my sister, Vanessa, of course, and will not think of going to the village. And a house that no one wants will quickly fall into disrepair, she said regretfully. And why sell it? We have the money now. We can repair it and use it as a summer house. Perhaps your sister will come there then too? Elsa was not wrong about that. Vanessa, without much worrying about the divorce from Andrew, not that let herself go to all the wrong things, she just continued her wild life. Despite the fact that she had graduated from college, she was not going to work, hoping to live happily on her father's money. Oliver could not refuse anything to his daughter, whom he used to consider the only one, although sometimes tired of her antics, which were forgivable only for a teenage girl, said to Vanessa. "I don't make me think I've chosen the wrong daughter." To this, Vanessa defiantly replied, "And you try to trade up. From what I understand, it's going great. She'll be a worthy daughter for you." "That's nonsense," the father said angrily. "Don't you think I'm eternal? I've been to the doctor. They say serious heart and vascular problems. And I wasn't afraid for myself, but for you. How will you live when you're alone?" "Oh, don't be so frightened. You'll live and live. At least you have to marry me off to a good man. I'm still watching." "Don't you think?" laughed the daughter, not taking her father's words about health seriously at all. But he was not joking and was seriously worried about his daughter's future. "You're looking, but I don't see what you're looking at yet. I haven't seen any good men who'd be willing to marry a beautiful dummy." "Well, thank you, Daddy. You have a good opinion of me," Vanessa took offense, not thinking of correcting herself. However, her father's warnings turned out to be not an empty sound. Oliver died suddenly, leaving everything to his only daughter Vanessa, without even mentioning Elsa in his will. However, it was Elsa and her husband who had to bury him. Vanessa could only sob and wring her hands, showing her inconsolable grief. Elsa tried to calm her sister, to make her believe that she was an adult and should live on her own without doing anything stupid. But she doubted very much that her sister perceived her words. And so it came to pass. Vanessa's grief passed very quickly, and since she had never been particularly practical, she could not work and was not going to. She squandered her fortune quite quickly and ended up with nothing. Where was she supposed to go after that? Only to her sister. Of course, the only person who could, if not help financially, then at least sympathizes. Elsa, already working in the credit department of her husband's bank, received her sister very cordially. She did not remember any past offenses and knew only that she had to help a person who had nothing and no one left. Now it was as if they had switched roles. Elsa was a successful, happy woman in her personal life, and Vanessa needed help. Her sister didn't refuse her, helping her with her job and some other problems. But about the fact that I'm not going to support you all the time, I tell you at once. You are a grown-up, educated woman. You should think about your own life. You have a flat, a job, all the conditions for a normal existence. Even a house in the village. If you haven't forgotten, I remember everything, said Vanessa, who seemed to be only now beginning to grow up. I'm very grateful to you, and I'll try not to ruin my life completely. Meanwhile, Andrew, having served his time, was released. He was given a short sentence and served it without much trouble. But when he got out, he realized that it would not be easy to start all over again. He tried to appeal to his ex-wife, hoping that if she could not help, then at least support him. But he received such a fierce rebuff that he realized that he could not achieve anything else here. But then what to do? He was not used to work. He had to invent some new schemes that would help him to get on with his life. When he learned that Elsa had a son by him, he decided to restore his paternal rights. But it turned out that Elsa, like Vanessa, wasn't going to have anything more to do with him. "What son, Andrew?" she asked. "My boy has a father, and it's not you." "What kind of father is he?" "An adopted one. I have the right to raise my child myself. I'll sue you. And you won't get away with it. At least you'll be obliged to ensure our communication." And he kept his promise and sued. But what could he hope for? Lonely, convicted, without a job, a stable income, or even a place of his own. He hoped, to be honest, that Elsa and her husband would decide to pay him off with a tidy sum. But no, he didn't scare anyone. He couldn't prove anything. And so he left the courthouse, deprived of his last hope. The child was left with his parents, whom he considered his own and the only ones. And Andrew was forbidden even to see him. Emily couldn't understand why Jason was so obsessed with this aquarium. They'd been living together for almost 10 years, and he had never once told her he was into fish. Now the huge 600-liter tank stretched along the entire wall of the living room. There swam back and forth just two mullet, mustachioed, scaly fish, each centimeters long, 10 centimeters. At the bottom of the aquarium, my husband had set up models of sunken cities and ships, and he'd even bought imitation chests of gold. "Jason, how much money did you put into this?" "You always said it was expensive and a hassle to get a dog," Emily asked. Sure, Jason had a good job, but you couldn't call them rich. He was a frugal man too, and he wouldn't even let his wife spend money at beauty parlors. He said she could dye her own hair and get a manicure. Not so much, but look how beautiful everything looks. I can come from work, look at the fish, plants in my sunken city, and make good decisions. I was advised to get an aquarium by Mike, my new partner. He went up dramatically after he got one, Jason replied. Jason had talked about Mike many times before, almost raving about his new acquaintance. So all he heard was Mike this, Mike that, as if he were the end of the world. Emily hadn't noticed that about her husband before. He seemed to prefer to make his own decisions. But come on, after all, it's not drinking and partying. It's a harmless hobby. But since Jason wanted this aquarium so badly, she'd endure the hassle of cleaning it, changing the water, and feeding it. "Jason, I don't mind. But why is it so huge?" "The fish in it are quite small." The wife had already made peace. Emily tried to always smooth over conflicts in the family. "You know, arowanas, or dragonfish like space, they can grow very long, more than a meter. And then what to transplant them to another aquarium? No, it's traumatic for them. It is better to immediately buy one that fits," explained the husband, and also added that you cannot open the lid for a long time. And in general, you should make sure that it is tightly closed. A Romanos like to jump and can die. Okay, I get it. I'll try to keep them happy, Emily sighed sadly. Her father was a fisherman in the village. It was through him that Emily had met Jason. She was barely 19 then. She was going to study nursing, but her mom got sick. So she never went. She worked part-time in the village as a store clerk. When her mother felt better, that day a handsome, broad-shouldered city man came in. I could tell he was not from around here. No one in the village wore fancy shoes in October. The roads weren't very good, so rubber shoes were the natural choice. And Emily peered curiously into the stranger's green, marsh-colored eyes. They were small and wide-set. The nose was slightly pushed into the face, and the chin was generously outlined. It made the customer look like a superhero from a foreign movie. "Is that you, Emily?" the guy asked with a smile. He looked to be about 25. It was only later that she learned her husband was 12 years older, just looked younger. "Let's say, what do you want?" The stranger broke the unspoken rule of not saying hello. And he was talking a little too brashly, wasn't he? And that was why Emily was wary. "Don't worry. Your father and I met on a fishing trip, and I lost to him. Now I have to buy the groceries on this list." The guy told me his name was Jason. He came from a long way away. Always thought he was a master fisherman. But Emily's father only laughed at the newfangled fishing rod and elaborate bait. So with a homemade rod, he caught much bigger and faster. He must have been very angry with that young imposter who bragged about his skills. "I'm not complaining," Jason replied evasively and calmly paid for the order. The amount was $200. He didn't even bat an eyebrow. Fine, Emily thought. You think if you've got money, everyone's going to jump on you. This Jason was obviously flirting with her. He'd suggested going to a club tonight to unwind. "I prefer to stay home and not go to a club. And you shouldn't either. The locals don't like it when the townspeople take their girls away. That's putting it mildly." Emily decided then to warn the catcher. Sure, he's nasty, thinks a lot of himself, but he did them a favor nonetheless. Father hadn't been feeling well lately. It was hard to earn a living. Her mother was suffering from memory lapses, and the situation was getting worse. Emily's father didn't ask for the bet. It was a townie who suggested it. He got what he deserved. "I'm not really afraid of fights. I can stand up for myself. But if you don't like going to clubs, you can just go out tomorrow. Do you have a boyfriend?" "I'm sorry to ask, but I need to know what to prepare for," Jason asked. He winked at Emily again. His insistence was disconcerting. She wasn't exactly pretty, not by country standards. The boys weren't like that, and that's why they nicknamed her the bobblehead. And if she had any suitors, others immediately teased her. They said he was breathing in her navel. But it wasn't true. She's not that tall. But the meter 75, not a verdict. Still, when everyone around her was at least 5 to 10 centimeters shorter, it became a real problem. It was only then that she noticed Jason was at least a head taller than her. Is that why she liked him a little bit after all, despite his cocky behavior? Yeah, cocky guy, but charming. He's got a certain confidence about him. When you see him, you want to believe. He will decide everything. All the difficulties in advance will predict. And you'll be like a stone wall behind him, Emily thought. "I've only had one suitor, but he's a problem," she said aloud. Emily answered truthfully. Bobby Shockett, a year younger than her, was the son of a local farmer, richer by village standards. He was a red-headed brute, 6 feet tall, and he followed her around like a rabbit. He couldn't get away. "My big man, you'll wait for me. I'll be your husband," he shouted to her if anyone laid eyes on her. He beat her mercilessly. Even though he's small, he's mad, red-haired, and evil. In anger, when he was a boy, he said he'd marry her anyway. And no matter how Emily waved him away, Bobby was hooked. Strange that such an attractive girl has only one suitor. I thought I'd have to fight off a whole bunch of them. "You look like a model," Jason didn't joke when he saw the tall, statuesque girl with the emerald green eyes and the long, almost black braid. He was stunned. Maybe her lips were a little chubby and her facial features a little large. But what a queen. Everything is with her, and her stature and her speech was measured with a sense of dignity. He'd never seen anyone like her before. You must be joking. You know, I've already seen some of those visiting chasers who think that only fools live in the village. Believe me, it's not. There's nothing wrong with our brains, Emily told him reproachfully. She was talking to him like a human being, and he'd fallen for cheap compliments. He'd found an ethereal beauty. Emily had been young then, and she'd never imagined that her looks could impress anyone but a stubborn, spoiled farmer's son. And yet Jason, to her surprise, found 1,001 reasons to come to the village, whether it was to go fishing with his friends or to say he'd come for mushrooms. Bobby hated him and beat him behind the barn. Jason somehow managed to win, but Bobby didn't give up. Jason didn't give up. He befriended Emily's father, and for 2 years he visited them on various occasions. Emily, what do you think of Jason? Do you like him? The father noticed that his daughter only pretended to be annoyed by the pushy townsman, but she was happy. When he arrives, her cheeks are rosy, and she's all dreamy about something. I don't know, she really didn't know how to tell her father then, that the townsman was too secretive. Nothing is known about his family, allegedly from an orphanage, he said at first. And when he said he was hired by an old friend of his father's. Before that, he said he didn't know his parents or their acquaintances. He seemed to be a nobody. And at such a young age, to have an apartment in the city, and a 3-bedroom. That's where Jason had called Emily, letting her parents come with her. I mean, you can't leave them. They gave birth to you late. They're in poor health, but you can't leave them in the country, and it was true. Emily's father and mother had no idea that they would have children, and only when the mother was 40, the father 45, learned the happy news. Parents were crazy about their daughter, nurtured and cherished. She literally bathed in their love. Except that 2 years ago, her mother did not recognize her for the first time. Since then, the father began to give up, and the back seized, and his legs failed. He tried to hide it all. He said it healed like a dog. Only Emily could see that even just getting out of bed was difficult for the muscle bear. And then, when she was in this desperate situation, Jason just dropped out of the sky like a prince. He seems decent, offers to sign tomorrow, picks her up with her parents at the very moment when there's nowhere else to wait for help. And she likes him. Maybe not in love yet, but is liking someone so much a bad start to a relationship. Jason can make her laugh, gives her gifts, compliments her. He works. No bad habits, doesn't drink. He's even taller than Emily. Sounds like the whole package. But what else is there to look for? But still, there was something faintly murky about him. She couldn't quite put her finger on it. Maybe Jason was right. Maybe men are just different. Then how could Emily's father understand him? He was all there, honest, open, loving. This one was always avoiding direct questions, and there were inconsistencies in his stories about family and work. It was unsettling, but the girl didn't know if she should share it with her father. She's all grown up. She was given a chance by fate to help her family, to thank her parents for raising her and loving her endlessly. It's a sin not to take it. Daughter, I want to tell you something, the father began. I know you're worried about your mother and me, but if you're not sure about Jason, you shouldn't marry him. I've got a little savings. We'll get by. We'll see. Her father was wise, realizing without saying anything that Emily wasn't entirely sure she wanted to marry a pushy townie. Don't you like him? She asked bluntly. You know, I can't understand him, and that's not a good sign. I'll tell you honestly, even if you married Bobby, I'd feel better about it. Yeah, he's got some dope playing in him right now, but he'll calm down and be a normal, responsible man. There's no need to rush into it, Dad said. Dad's right. It's not so much that I like Jason, it's that he'll solve problems. It doesn't have to be that way. When he gets here, I'll tell him not to come over anymore, Emily thought to herself. The decision seemed so clear and deliberate that Emily was sure it was the right thing to do. Of course, she would never marry Bobby. He was too much of a tease. Maybe he wasn't a bad guy in his own way, but Emily wasn't going to live with him. Let someone else put up with the antics of the local rich man's spoiled son. Jason didn't arrive until a month later and attended Emily's father's funeral. Her father's death had taken a toll on the girl. It seemed to her that the life had gone out of the house. It stood without windows, without doors, blown through the air. Even though it was only September, it was as dank as if winter had begun. One good thing was that her mother didn't realize that her beloved husband had died. Emily had asked the neighbors not to invite her to the funeral. Her mother, for some reason, thought some neighbor had died. She had forgotten she was married at all and thought she was Emily's little sister. Well, maybe God spared Mom. That's why he gave her this disease. But I have to take care of her, she thought. Jason, having learned about her grief, flew over instantly, organized everything, paid for everything. Emily was grateful to him. The decision not to commit to him seemed foolish. She couldn't afford romance. Right now, she and her mom just needed to survive, and she wasn't likely to pull it off. The money would run out. And then what? Not much in savings. Emily, listen, let's get married. I want to get you and your mom out of this village. Everything here will remind you of your father. Jason said it without his usual smugness. He just looked into his eyes, quietly and carefully. He'd won her over. Emily hadn't realized he could be so compassionate and sympathetic. Jason, but that wouldn't be fair of me. You're very charming. It makes me feel good that you can solve problems and all that. But it's not like I've had time to love you yet, the girl admitted. She didn't want to start her life with deception. But I'm already sure. I only need you, he replied. Also then did not say a word about love. But Emily did not pay attention to it, and only then remembered more and more often that the cherished I love you he never once said. And so it was settled. They quietly signed. Everything was honorable. Jason moved her and her mother back to the city. And Emily was thrilled that her longtime admirer had gone to the city to study to be a cop. Bobby was bound to say something nasty. And then family life began. Jason was on the road most of the time. He was weird about money. On the one hand, he paid for his mother's caregiver and even let her order cleaning services. But on the other hand, he was careful not to let his wife handle the money. It was as if he was afraid that one day she would slip away from him. He didn't trust her. Once or twice a week checked all expenses to the exact cent and did not give expensive gifts. Even once joked that gold and jewelry are given only to wives who want to give a chance to leave as soon as possible. He often told me that Eastern women demand as many gold bracelets and rings as possible to put on themselves if their husband kicks them out. But you don't have any such plans, do you? Jason asked once again when Emily asked for permission to pass her driver's license and drive his car, which was sitting idle most of the time anyway. After all, wasn't he home all the time? No, why would you think that? We seem to be doing fine. It just pains me not to have a baby, Emily replied. It was a subject they rarely discussed. It was painful. They lived and lived. Emily cooked, did the laundry, studied to be a nurse, and convinced her husband that everything was just like people. Even sewed her own clothes. Jason approved of any form of thrift and economy. But there were no real heart-to-heart conversations with her husband. He was growing more and more distant. More and more he said that talking to his wife was a waste of time. Emily thought that having a baby would bring them closer together. She suggested to Jason that if God didn't give her own yet, she could adopt or foster. But the spouse was very angry in response. Emily, I understand you're afraid of going crazy from idleness. Why don't you think of some feminine hobby? Or is taking care of your sick mother and me not enough for you? He asked irritably. Jason, we have a house full of people. Why can't we give happiness to some poor little kid? She cried then too. Actually, she was painfully lonely too. Her mom remembered her in rare moments of clarity, but she forgot. Jason was home 2 days a week at the most, usually less. And then he'd come home late at night and go straight to bed. He was always busy, and she felt like a waste of space in their nice apartment. If there was a child in the house, everything would change. Emily, I'm sure you'll excuse me, but I'm not a blank slate in our house. Have you gotten a checkup? Her husband asked sternly, and she immediately felt guilty, already regretting having started this conversation. Yes, I'm fine. The doctor said it would be a good idea for you to see him. Emily had told her husband about it before, but he kept dragging it out. I told you, I'm perfectly fine. Isn't my word enough for you? He almost burned her with his gaze. Look, but what makes you so sure? Do you already have a kid? Emily was beginning to think more and more their spouse really did have a son or daughter growing up somewhere. And that's why he's so relaxed about his spouse not being able to give birth. There's an heir somewhere. Whatever. I see the topic of the child has already turned into paranoia, so here's to shut it down once and for all. Remember, I do not need orphans and other nonsense. Give birth yourself or forget about children. Cut off the husband and went to bed, loudly slamming the door. Emily hadn't brought it up since then. Sometimes she thought about the fact that Jason couldn't have children, but it hurt him. That's why he's so angry. There were also thoughts that his spouse has bad genetics, and that's why he doesn't want kids, and he doesn't want to say it outright. Emily didn't know how to solve this issue yet. If her husband had a warm and close relationship, it would be possible to somehow shorten the age of 2. And after all, a man and woman are also a family. But as it happened, she was used to him, and even loved him in her own way. Jason, on the other hand, had come to see her as a free addition to the house. The admiration and adoration was gone from his eyes. If he hadn't loved her completely before, but at least he'd considered himself lucky to have her, he wasn't even jealous now. He stopped asking how she spent her time and who she socialized with. They were like these two mustachioed fish that swam past each other in a huge aquarium, not even touching against the backdrop of youth, a sunken city, ships and chests of gold. Maybe that was why the aquarium annoyed her so much. It reminded her too much of the current situation. Mom liked the aquarium. She childishly admired the mustachioed fish, looked at the details of the sunken city, columns and copies of ancient statues. We should change something. The daughter looked pale. There was a rare day when Mom offered something sensible and true. "How are you feeling today?" Emily asked the small, almost thin woman. All that remained of the old mom were the huge emerald eyes and the voice of the treasure she'd inherited. They remained bright, radiating kindness and light, though Mama remembered little. Her beautiful soul continued to love everything and everyone around her, and Mom's mood was almost always good. "What kind of mom am I?" "I'm your little sister," she laughed. The intelligence that shone in her eyes turned out to be an illusion. Mommy didn't even remember who her daughter was. "I'm sorry, Mommy." Emily called her by her name as she asked, and again clarified how she was feeling. "Fine, can I try on your dresses? Your husband has already left." Mom wasn't very reality-oriented, but somehow she remembered when it was best to stay out of Jason's house and not annoy him. "Sure, except they're big for you." Emily shook her head bitterly. It was as if her mom was drying out and shrinking in size every year. Would she leave her too? Who would she live with? With the silent fish? "It's okay. I'll grow up soon and be as beautiful as you." Her mother looked at her lovingly and threw herself around her neck. "The memory is gone, the love remains," Emily thought with surprise. She used to think that when people said that love was the most reliable investment of time and energy, they were just pretty words. But that's just the way it was. No one can be sure of keeping their mind, health, and wealth, but love never goes anywhere. Emily often dreamed of her daddy hugging her and thanking her for taking care of her mom. Even though it was all just in her dreams, when she woke up she felt warmth in her heart. Emily was very comforted by the thought that someday up there in heaven she would be together with loving people, and they would be young and beautiful again, and her mother would be sure to remember her. "Are you beautiful now?" Emily sighed sadly. She suddenly thought that she didn't have a baby. It probably because that was the role Mom was in right now. The thought seemed sacrilegious to her. No, she wouldn't rush her mom into the other world to have a real baby in her life. All in good time. Maybe when she's in her 40s she'll have someone. I mean, her parents gave birth to her late in life. What if it's a family tradition? Her mom laughed happily as she ran to measure her dress. Emily, on the other hand, remembered that Jason had left a good sum of money to call someone to help with the aquarium, clean the huge glass rectangle, replace the water in it. Not an easy task. She decided to call a housekeeper. Let someone earn money, and she would really need the help. The phone number in the ad was answered by a pleasant young woman. "Yes, of course, I can help with house cleaning too. When to come over?" At least now, Emily was glad that she wouldn't have to deal with the glass monster alone. Anna turned out to be a pleasant, red-haired young woman, not yet 30. She said she'd grown up in the village too, and it turned out that they were fellow countrymen. "I wouldn't have thought you were the cousin of the Bobby who's been bugging me with his advances." Emily was delighted to learn that she was related to the funny little fellow who had tormented her with his love. And you shouldn't laugh. Bobby, by the way, has become a good policeman and often thinks of you. You know, he's a good man. He even helps me out with money. I couldn't raise the kids without him. Sarah said that even though she's only 20, she had to adopt her late sister's boys. What do you do if they get sucked into the water when boating to a neighboring village? Turns out Sarah lived with her parents on the opposite shore. That was why they hadn't met Emily. Come on, Sarah, it's not like I'm being mean. If you must know, my late dad used to say Bobby would be a real man someday. He even recommended we wait for him, Emily said. Emily felt embarrassed that she had unwittingly offended her countrywoman, but she couldn't help her feelings. Of course you should marry for love, Sarah sighed. That hadn't worked out for her either. So soon as her seemingly devoted fiance found out that she was adopting 3 boys of different ages, he immediately disappeared and married someone else the same year. Maybe it was for the best. Fate has saved. It was only after the wedding that I found out that he was having an affair with a lot of people, and I was so naive, believing that I was the only one he had, she added. But you have kids, and I dreamed so much, but I cannot give birth myself. Although everything seems to be normal on the female side, and my husband won't let me take anyone from the orphanage, Emily said. I guess life is like that. There's always something missing, Sarah said philosophically, and they started tinkering with the aquarium. Wow, it's so dirty, it's like it's been a year since anyone changed the water, Emily marveled. Sarah told her that she helps maintain a few aquariums at restaurants. It was in a way one of her specialties. You couldn't make much money cleaning, so she decided to learn all about aquariums. It paid well, and the hours are shorter, and she had a unique skill. Yeah, my husband only recently acquired it, I think. Maybe he just overdid it with the decorations and plants, Emily asked. Well, unless he's constantly moving them around, there could be sediment rising from the bottom, shrugged Sarah. That's the way it is. You see, those chests are constantly moving. I even laughed at him, like, isn't there real treasure in there? Emily said. Emily picked up one of the chests from the bottom of the empty tank. The fish had been placed in a small container for now, so she decided to give everything a good rinse straight from the tap. Maybe they weren't varnished. That's what makes the water cloudy then, Sarah suggested. She took one of the chests from Emily's hands and wanted to help rinse it properly. But as she rubbed it with one brush, it suddenly opened and something wrapped in foil fell out onto the table. What is it? Emily took a pair of scissors and carefully cut away the duct tape that wrapped the roll up. It turned out there were several layers wrapped at once. In front of her were clear, faceted stones. Are they diamonds? Sarah exhaled. Wait a minute. There's a jewelry store nearby. You can find out for sure. Would you like me to show you one? Emily was dumbfounded and nodded silently. And only when Sarah had already left, she thought that if they were really diamonds, it was unlikely that her assistant would return. She told herself there wasn't enough money for the kids all the time. I'm stupid. So what am I going to do now? How do I explain to my husband that one of the stones is missing? Were Emily's first thoughts. But then they were replaced by even more disturbing ones. Emily suddenly realized that Jason probably hadn't moved the chests at all. He'd swapped them for other chests. That was clever. They look like aquariumologists. There's fake jewelry on top under the open lid, but the real thing's inside. Is that why Jason had forbidden her to help clean his stuff lately when the aquarium came up? She'd even sometimes thought he was hiding a gift for his mistress. But it was much worse than that. It turns out that her husband probably worked as a courier and transported these diamonds to some customers. That's why he flies from one country to another so often. And since he had to hide it all, it was obviously something illegal. And Emily clutched her head and flopped down on the couch, groaning. That was when the doorbell rang. Oh, good thing they opened it. I was wishing I'd gone back for the phone. I've been ringing the doorbell for about 20 minutes. I was afraid something had happened to you, Jason said. Sarah reported on the trip to the jewelry store, saying that they were indeed diamonds, and very clear ones at that. The jeweler persistently asked where she'd gotten them. Tried to write down the address. Acted suspicious. Where would such a poorly dressed woman get a stone worth as much as an apartment? How did you manage to keep your composure, not to be confused? I don't know how I would have behaved, Emily wondered. Sarah didn't bother to say how embarrassed she was that she suspected her countrywoman of not returning and keeping the jewel for herself. And I just said I was working as a maid for rich owners. They are leaving their husbands, so they want to sell it. And while the jeweler was thinking, I left, Sarah explained, and her cheeks burned with joy that she had not let her countrywoman down. Thank you. It's a good thing you don't live in our neighborhood. You know, I didn't know anything about the jewelry myself. It's so scary that my husband might be doing something illegal. I'm going to try to look into it. And please don't tell anyone, especially not Bobby. You know the police are no help in family matters. Emily blushed. She handed Sarah all the savings she had at the moment. Oh, really? You don't have to pay that much at all. But of course, I won't say anything to anyone. You can be sure of that. You know my situation. I have 3 little ones on my hands. Money's tight. And I don't want to let you down. Of course, you and your husband are on your own, but be careful. Call me if you need anything. If not, I'll never bother you myself, Sarah replied. She helped to pack the diamonds back. Together they made sure that every chest at the bottom opened to reveal real treasures. Then they poured clean water into the aquarium and started the treasure guardians, as it turned out, the real ones. Sarah collected the water spilled on the floor and said goodbye to the landlady. Emily looked in on her mom. She was asleep with her daughter's dresses scattered around her room. One pink one was cradled in her arms. Apparently liked it the best. Oh, Mom, things are happening here. I don't know what to do, Emily whispered. Her mother, of course, wouldn't have been able to advise her, even if she hadn't been asleep. But Emily was still relieved that Mommy was alive and loved her. She rolled over onto her other side and continued to sleep serenely. Emily was alone with her heavy thoughts. Jason was due back in a couple days. She didn't have much time to drop everything and run away. Where to? To the old country house with a sick mom? Rent an apartment while Jason was gone? Go to the police. But first of all, there's no money for that. And she wouldn't risk selling the diamonds. Secondly, there was still some chance that Jason was a decent man. Maybe a friend asked him to keep the diamonds. What if they were family heirlooms that for some reason were dangerous to keep at home? She'd heard her husband on the phone with someone he knew recently. Bailiffs were supposed to come into the house because the company went bankrupt. Maybe he's hiding the jewelry so there's something left over for a rainy day. Yeah, they don't have the closest, warmest relationship. But that doesn't mean the husband's a criminal. There are emotionally cold people who are hard to relate to. After all, they would have lived together for so many years, and for all that time her husband has not done anything bad to her. Why would she think that about him right away? We should give it a chance to clear things up. It was too hard to leave right away. It was easier to convince herself that it wasn't really that bad. The next day, in the evening, her husband called. I'll be back early tomorrow morning. I won't be alone. Why didn't you say earlier? I won't have time to cook anything for company, will I? Said Emily, upset. Oh, don't worry about it. This isn't some business team. We're all family people, friends. So they're just spending the night at my place in a homey way, you know. They're from out of town, and we're all going to be tired. We don't want to be stuck in hotels. So just get the rooms ready. Can you sleep over one night with your mom, by the way? Jason asked affectionately. Sure. Well, I'll try to cook something I have time for, though, Emily promised. She wasn't too pleased that her husband wouldn't be alone. She had wanted to talk to him alone so badly, and it just so happened that he was arriving with company at that very moment. Jason didn't show up in the morning, but just in time for dinner. 2 of his friends did have wives. The one brunette in a bright red dress was without her husband and didn't look married at all. Oh, will your spouse be here later? Emily asked her. Maybe he will, she laughed hoarsely and glared at Jason, as if it were up to him whether or not her husband showed up. Honey, don't mind him. Katie has a peculiar sense of humor. She and her husband just have a complicated relationship. They seem to have a child together, but she doesn't want to live in the same apartment with him. Emily's husband knew a surprising amount about this Katie's family. And even stranger was the fact that Jason had suddenly decided to gossip about someone else's family in her presence. It was unlike the normally reserved man. Maybe my husband is doing something wrong and has too many secrets, Katie asked defiantly. She was pushing hard on the red stuff. It was evident in her complexion and agitated state. This conversation is going in the wrong direction. Those two are just competing on the job. That's why they're fighting. Don't mind them, said the full bald man, the oldest in the company. I try not to torture my wife with work talk. Her job is just to be beautiful and organize a comfortable home. Jason smiled. The brunette returned but remained silent. The others began to praise the homeowner's cozy home and toast it to his beautiful wife. Katie continued to stare at Jason all evening and laughed inappropriately when he talked to Emily about something. She felt uneasy. Who is that, anyway? A mistress. But why did Jason bring her home? Emily didn't understand a thing. The evening was ruined. It was a good thing the visiting nurse was entertaining her mom that evening, so at least she didn't have to worry about that tonight. Jason, will you help me in the kitchen? She made it clear several times that there was an urgent conversation to be had. But you usually do just fine on your own, her husband exasperated. Yeah, but that's not the point. I have a conversation to have with you, Emily was finally forced to admit. Honey, you can see I'm tired. Is it something urgent? Are you giving birth right today? Jason, for some reason, decided to hit exactly the sore spot. Even his companions and their wives stared at him in surprise. Only Katie laughed gloatingly, as if she was enjoying Emily's humiliation. No, but it's an emergency. I'll wait for you in the kitchen. Emily stood up defiantly and walked out. No one followed her. She waited 10 minutes and suddenly heard loud exclamations in the living room. He might die soon, shouted a full man. Emily ran out and saw Jason lying unconscious on the couch. The brunette looked at her reproachfully and said, You're not keeping a good eye on your husband. Didn't you see that he didn't look well all evening? I can see why he doesn't look after his health. And I didn't know anything, Emily said, confused. Emily thought he was just tired after the trip. She tried to feel for her husband's pulse, but the full-figured man pushed her away. It's best not to touch him. The doctor will be here any minute. You don't want to finish him off. Emily tried to say she'd finished her nursing course, but the doorbell was already ringing. She ran to open it. The ambulance did indeed arrive surprisingly quickly. It's so urgent we need to hospitalize him. Are you with us? The doctor asked her. Of course. I'll just give instructions to the nurse. Emily asked the nurse to stay with her mom a little longer and left some money. Already on the road, they managed to find out that they were not going to the city hospital, but to a private clinic. Don't worry, we've known Michael Matthews for a long time. He paid for everything. A free ambulance, would have been traveling for how long? And it sounds like he saved your husband's life, the doctor said, and went on to praise the guest at length. Thank him, of course, was all Emily could say. It was all wrong somehow. Her husband had gotten sick for no good reason. He didn't look sick or tired at all, and the guests were alone. The nurse hardly left Mom's room. Of course, they didn't know anything about the jewelry, but it was still kind of scary to leave strangers in the apartment. But it was too late to think about that now. It took them an hour to get to the clinic. The building was small and suspiciously shabby. Your husband has a congenital heart defect. It's very serious. We need to move him to the regional hospital, the doctor said after the examination, which took another hour. She also sternly explained that they couldn't transport him there for free. But Michael Matthews is supposed to be paying for the treatment. Emily's head was spinning with all the events. She couldn't keep up with them and didn't understand anything. Yes, and we'll put the money back into his account. In the meantime, your spouse needs to be taken to the regional. Were you ready to take him at your own expense? The doctor asked. I don't have much money. Emily pulled her wallet out of her husband's pocket. She herself hadn't even thought about money when she left, and now she was berating herself for it. Katie was right, she was a bad wife, and she was angry with her for nothing. It's not much, but it's enough. The doctor went to arrange transportation, and Emily asked permission to see her husband, but was informed that he was too weak and generally under IV, so that couldn't be arranged right now. Emily was finally convinced of her helplessness and cried with resentment. While she'd suspected Jason, she'd missed his attack. And how would she feel about losing the only person who cared about her at a time like this? What would she remember? The way she tried to poison the last hours of his life? It was very bitter, and Emily felt ungrateful and destructive. Jason may not be perfect, but he tried. He'd worked hard for her on those business trips, and she hadn't appreciated it. That's how it works. When it took another hour in the ambulance to the regional hospital, the doctors wouldn't even let her touch her husband, who never opened his eyes or said anything. "Honey, I'm sorry. Get well. I really need you," she whispered to him through her tears. But there was no response. And there was no money left to get a cab home. She spent the night in the hospital right in the corridor, sitting on an uncomfortable metal chair, and she had nightmares. Her husband was in a coffin at the bottom of an aquarium. His body was covered in diamonds. She cried silently. She couldn't breathe because she was underwater too. "Hey, go home." In the morning, the nurse woke her up and told her that she couldn't help her husband for the time being. When he got better, she'd get a call. So will he live? That's all Emily wondered. The nurse called the doctor, who, after half an hour, confirmed that Jason had been placed in a special room and all the necessary care had been arranged. But she couldn't see him yet. The doctor promised to contact her when visits were allowed. Emily took 2 transfers to get home. When she arrived, she was literally exhausted. "How's Jason?" "He's fine." The nurse was very happy to see her. "It looks like it should be all right," Emily said. "Did your guests leave last night?" Emily thought that was kind of odd, but in the end it was even better. She didn't have the energy for hospitality at all right now. "Emily, and those strange people were playing with the fish. I told them they didn't like it, and no one listened to me," Thomas told her suddenly a few days later. "Maybe you imagined it." Emily remembered that her mom thought of her as an older sister. "I'm not. I'm an adult. They pulled out the trunks and put the others in there. And the fattest one called me a crazy old woman for some reason. Even though I explained that I was in 2nd grade and a very good girl," the mother said resentfully. Emily asked her for other details. Mom had indeed seen the guests. There was no doubt about that. She described it in great detail. Only the horrible thought of missing diamonds suddenly crept into her head. Emily pulled out the trunks, opened the bottom, and was stunned. There was nothing inside, nothing. And she knew for a fact that before the guests had come, the chests had been full of diamonds. So the guests had taken them, while she was at the hospital with her husband. "We need to talk to Jason. It's very important." The doctor told her that her husband had already regained consciousness. "Yes, hello. This is Jason's wife. I need to talk to him," she yelled into the phone. "Look, I understand you're worried, but for now, the patient shouldn't be worried. It could cost him his life." The nurse said this both yesterday and the day before. Emily had already memorized those words by heart. "It really is very important. If you don't put him on the phone, I'll come over and talk to him anyway," she said in desperation. So even though she knew her husband was undergoing serious treatment, there were valuables worth a huge amount stolen. Emily had to tell him. Jason was the only one who would know what to do in this case. "I hate to say this, but someone has to help the patient survive. If you don't care about him, then it's our duty to save him. We simply won't let you in. Even if you come," the nurse said sternly, and explained that for now, doctors were still fighting for Jason's life. "I'm sorry, of course. That's the most important thing." Emily burst into tears into the phone, and the response was simply to drop the call. She wouldn't feel so guilty if she saw that Jason was actually quite awake and cheerful. "So, have you calmed down, my boar?" he said with a laugh to the brunette who was posing as a nurse and answering his phone, eager to come over to revive you with a kiss. Laughed disdainfully Katie. "You know, I'd rather you did that." He pulled her gently to him. She laughed and climbed into his lap. Jason wasn't going to die. He wasn't even sick. He had to play this whole thing out just so his guests would learn the lessons of the aquarium. The aquarium had a very expensive security alarm system, and it only went off if someone opened the bottom. Jason didn't think Emily would open the diamond boxes. He'd planned an alarm system in case one of the partners decided to sneak in and rob him. And what was his surprise when he saw on the video camera that some unfamiliar redhead and his wife had decided to get the treasure. He wasn't going to explain anything to his wife, so he came up with this cunning plan with the hospital and the guests. "And that one looked at me so funny all evening. You can see that she loves you, jealous. And by the way, she's not as ugly as you said. Pretty cute," Katie said after the consolations were over. "Yeah, my Emily is just a redneck. Picked her up on purpose to rustle around the house and keep her quiet. There's no escape. Her mom's a freak. Jason had explained that to his mistress many times. He wasn't going to fight with Katie. It was her father, a powerful authority in the criminal world, who had once helped him transport stolen diamonds directly from the places where they were mined and sell them to interested parties. He'd also set him up as a manager to keep an eye on him, just so Jason would have an excuse to go back and forth. But of course, the main business was career work. Katie's father once sat in with his own. So when that one was put away because his tongue was too long, he decided to help his son. So he got him a cushy job after the orphanage, organized an apartment, recommended he get himself a wife to keep an eye out for, a simple one who minded her own business. Jason did just that, but he loved Emily in his own way. He couldn't even believe at first that he'd gotten such a rare beauty, the kind he'd never dreamed of. Of course, it wasn't that Jason would give his life for Emily. Rather, she was a tidbit that had just happened to fall into his lap. So only a fool would give up a faithful, decent, good-looking wife. But he wasn't going to say any of that. She kept him not only a profitable father, but also the son Ryan she'd borne him. The boy was already 4 years old. Criminal grandfather allowed to see him, but immediately warned that Ryan, with his father for the time being, will not live. Consider my grandson a pledge of our long-term partnership, Nick Edwards grinned. Every time Jason started a conversation that he was ready to adopt the boy and even go to Katie for good, his mistress looked at ease at the fact that she hardly ever saw her own child. Katie loved the fun life. Jason suspected she wasn't the only one with him. But in the end, who cared if he were too picky? He'd be thrown out of the family or finished off like his dad. Jason knew nothing about his mother, except that she'd given birth to him in prison and had given up all her rights. So when he was a kid, there was a lot of drinking and partying in the house. Eventually, his father put him in an orphanage and drank his way through the apartment, and then he died. Jason wasn't going to go down the same path. He wanted to find stability and become like Nick Edwards and live a life of peace and quiet. It's okay. He could put up with his son's powerful grandfather, but he wouldn't last forever. And if Jason does well, Nick Edwards will hand him the reins. That's when it could get really big. And if he wasn't going to leave Emily, she suited him just fine. She was a worthy piece in his collection. If only she didn't piss him off with her fondness for the kids and didn't meddle where he didn't want her to. Jason was discreetly putting his wife on birth control, so he wasn't afraid they'd have someone. He didn't need too much in common with Emily. What if Katie demanded to leave her after all? And Jason didn't want his child growing up out there somewhere without him. Besides, he already had one. Emily was more compliant, with no kids, forced to tiptoe only in front of him. Jason was possessive and wouldn't share his wife with anyone else. Katie was different. He didn't consider her as a woman. She was just a bridge to her daddy, to his son, and to his wealth. He'd get rid of her someday. Except he'd have to wait for Nick Edwards to die first. At times, Jason even had thoughts that someday, when he'd solidified his position, that death might even somehow be hastened. But for now, it was too soon. In the meantime, while he was daydreaming about the power and wealth that would someday be his alone, they hadn't gotten a call from the aquarium owners in a couple weeks and had to make do with the usual cleaning. The rich were not very generous and extremely picky. Today, Sarah had gotten a whole rant because of a small speck of dust on the baseboard. The landlady had only paid her half the amount. Oh my God. She just has no idea what it's like for me with 3 little ones, 2-year-old Matt, his twin brother Sam, and 4-year-old Kevin. That's actually the reason Sarah got a common-law husband 6 months ago. But this Victor didn't help with the kids. Then he drank all the money while he was only good for one thing. Victor inherited an apartment from his late mother. That's where Sarah and the kids lived. What was he like? He wasn't mean, he wasn't evil, but he was absolutely useless. What was there to do? Her cousin offered to go back to the village, but she'd earn even less there. And here was a chance to cure Victor of his bad habit. To marry and raise children at home. There was nothing like that for them. There was no normal house, no kindergarten. The nearest hospital was far away, and there were only 2 doctors and a nurse working there, specialists in absolutely all matters. No, she could not leave the city, at least for the sake of her children. So she put up with hard work and reproaches. Everyone has their own cross to bear. And no, I feel sorry for you. I would like to help you so much. Victor constantly told her. After all, you do not drink your salary and children's allowances, she sighed. It was no use. But she couldn't make up her mind. It was good that there was a neighbor with 2 children who helped with the kids when she was at work. And she in return also sat with her 2 little daughters. At least the neighbor had an elderly mother who could boil porridge, go shopping for groceries. But she had no one in town at all. She was already approaching the entrance of the house when suddenly 2 sturdy strangers in short leather jackets blocked her way, and they looked unfriendly. "What do you want?" she asked. At first she thought Victor had borrowed from someone again and hadn't paid back. This was happening more and more often. "If you want your babies to be okay, forget about the diamonds," the short-cropped blonde man said. But the other one, the bald one, just looked at Sarah gloomily and said nothing. Her insides went cold with dread, and there was more of this to come. How had they even found her? Had Emily given her away? "Look, I forgot all about it a long time ago, and I wasn't going to tell anyone," Sarah said, stammering. "Well, you're giving it all away," the blonde said with a smirk. "Keep in mind, if anything happens, it's the kids that get hurt first. They're glorious. It'll be a shame if they don't grow up," the bald man said, and laughed so nastily that it was clear he wasn't going to spare anyone. A real thug. "We'd have to go to Bobby after all. I just can't go to the police and he'll say something. The cousin was going to be in town tomorrow." So Sarah told him she had a serious conversation with him, but she wouldn't say anything over the phone. It was just too dangerous. "Wow, I didn't think fate would bring me and Emily together like this. I should take a closer look at this case. It smells dangerous. I'd even say it smells like death." Bobby told his cousin that he would try to find out everything without attracting attention. He wrote down descriptions of the 2 men and Emily's address. Sarah felt a little more at peace. Bobby's reliable after all. If he promised to do what he could, it wasn't empty words. He had once gone to the same high school. And Sarah knew that even as a child, Bobby was not the spoiled son of a rich farmer that everyone thought he was. Yes, he was easy on the eyes, but when it came to something serious, he always came to the rescue. And those who knew him intimately trusted him, long before he joined the police force. At the same time, Emily decided to see her husband in hopes she could somehow negotiate with security. No matter what the nurse said on the phone, the case couldn't wait. Emily felt like she was sitting on a powder keg. "I'm sorry, I don't know who you called, but we didn't have a patient like that at all." The nurse rounded her eyes at her. "Wait, but he was already brought here last night. And I talked to the doctor." Emily described the doctor. It turned out that the gray-haired, mustachioed, blue-eyed, large man had never worked here. "I'm sorry. Are you confused about something? You can talk to the superintendent." Anyone. The nurse talked to Emily like she was crazy, and the unhappy young woman talked to whoever she could. Even showed Jason's picture in case they mixed up his chart. No one had seen him here. Could he have just tricked her and run away, and his cronies stolen the diamonds? The thought suddenly flashed through her mind. And it was clear that Jason had simply tricked her into running away with the jewelry. But how did he know she'd uncovered the stash? She should call Sarah and have her call Bobby, Emily thought, and was surprised to learn that the guy she'd once been in love with was already investigating her. When they met after a long separation, she didn't even recognize the red-haired young man who had once chased her at first. Bobby had stretched out, was now much taller than her. He'd also grown up a lot. He was unrecognizable. "Emily, I'm sorry for bothering you then. I was so afraid of losing you," he'd said the first time they'd met. "Well, what can you do? I teased you too. So even." Emily smiled and noticed that the guy still blushed when he saw her. But now for some reason it wasn't annoying, it even felt good. For about a week, Bobby told her that he'd gotten a lead on a group that was smuggling illegal contraband. Then all of a sudden he stopped contacting them, just disappeared. "Sarah, we need to get the word out. Bobby's in danger, involving the police already officially, and it needs to be reported that he was investigating," Emily said. But the kids could get hurt. I told you I've been threatened." Sarah was distraught. She felt sorry for her cousin, but also worried endlessly about the fate of the babies. "Understand, you can't drag this out. My husband has run away. He clearly had something to do with it. And who's behind Jason? It's scary to think about." You know how much each diamond is worth. Emily persuaded her to act. What they didn't know was that Jason was already wanted without them. And what happened was this. Nick Edwards had been talking to Katie in the car and didn't know that Jason, who wanted to get to know his relatives better, had deliberately bugged it. At that point, he hadn't decided whether or not to finally leave Emily. And the conversation he overheard made him very uncomfortable. Katie stopped seeing the guy for a while. Jason is far from stupid. He can see that his so-called son is very unlike him, Nick Edwards said. Dad, come on. Jason is a self-righteous turkey, can't see further than his nose. He's sure the world revolves around him, and there's nothing he wouldn't guess, Katie objected. I wouldn't underestimate him. Yes, he's obsessed with you, but he's not that stupid. And if he finds out he doesn't have a son, he might let himself off the hook, steal the jewelry, and then look for the wind in the field. But that's not even the point. It's that we have to find him and put him away so I don't have to worry. Do we need all this trouble? Nick Edwards asked. All right, I won't hang out with the guy just yet, although it's not much fun. Jason is such an arrogant bore. But money is more important, and so is my daddy's peace of mind about Katie. That's how they decided to make a fool out of me. But no, Jason didn't wait. He was gone the same day with everything. Fake passports, just in case, and hiding places he prepared long before. Like they say, you get what you get what you get. Nick Edwards had taught him to always be ready to make a move. Jason's first thought was of Emily's father's fishing cabin. The cabin was in the woods near a small lake. No one would be looking for him there for sure. And that's where he kept Bobby, but he was in the basement. And even Nick Edwards didn't know where he was. Jason said he just took out the cop. That's what he was going to do. But now it was taking a different turn. We could frame Nick Edwards and plant the body on him, his daughter. And that would be a surprise. All right, I'm in the city for now, and I'll get there in a couple days, Jason thought. He shouldn't have revealed himself right away. Surely everyone would be looking for him. True, he wasn't going to travel the roads by car. He could get there much safer by bicycle, through the woods and fields. And in the meantime, Bobby was in the basement. He also didn't remember anything. There was a dry crust of bread and some water nearby, and his hands and feet were tied. But still the food and water could be reached. He drank like a beast with his lips, and bit greedily into the dry bread. His head was splitting. Help, he had shouted many times before, but heard only the cries of forest birds in response. He had no memory of how he had gotten here or his enemy was. There were only 2 women in front of him, one redhead with babies, the other green-eyed with long, dark hair. Bobby remembered that he had to save them, but how? From whom? And at the same time, he knew he couldn't wait, and that was very important. If Bobby had known that death would catch up with him in a couple of days, he would have thought faster, but he'd forgotten everything. The wounds were taking all his strength. He even thought he should stop trying to untie the ropes and just die quietly. He was so weak, it was the easiest and best thing to do now. That very night, when Bobby had already resigned himself to the fact that he'd stopped struggling, Emily woke up in a sweat from her own screaming. She saw her daddy's lake house that he had once built himself to go fishing. There were good spots nearby, and sometimes he even took his daughter with him. There was Bobby in the basement for some reason. In the dream, he was young again, almost a child, and he was calling out to her for help. His head was covered in blood, and on a bicycle, Death rode up to the house with a scythe. It grinned ominously, and Death looked like Jason for some reason. And Emily thought the dream looked like a dream, so she called a nurse for her mom right at night. Then she booked a cab with the last of her savings and went to her late father's house. Mom, how did you know that? Daughter, you're to Daddy right. And Emily looked at her in surprise, but there was no time to question. It was the only time Mom finally remembered that Emily was her daughter, and there was no time to talk. How hurtful is that? She arrived at her dad's cabin in the morning, asked the cabbie to wait. Somehow she had no doubt when she lifted the manhole cover that Bobby would be there, and I hoped he was alive. Who are you? You're the one I have to save, Bobby mumbled in his delirium. He couldn't remember who was in front of him, but he knew for sure that he had been in love with this woman for a long time, and he had to help her. It's me, Emily. Come on, we have to get out before it's too late. Then Emily cut his restraints, treated his wounds with the supplies she'd brought with her, threw her dad's raincoat over Bobby so the cab driver wouldn't notice the wounds, and drove him to her house. It was Jason's house, but he wouldn't go there now. So it was safe for now. A couple days later, Bobby's memory came back. "Emily, you need to testify right away," he said. That's before you know it. She was so scared for him. Suddenly she realized Dad was right. We should have waited for Bobby. Now he was no longer seen as an annoying young man, but as a man who would do anything for her. And back in her delirium, while she'd been courting him, he kept saying he loved her. And for some reason that memory was warming now. "Look, I remember everything I need to. The longer we drag this out, the more dangerous it is for you, for Sarah," Bobby insisted. He immediately provided the information that had both Katie and her father in custody. Details came out that clarified why no one had seen Jason at the hospital. Turns out he was brought to the off wing, and there were fake people on duty there. And there was no paid hospital where Emily had gone. There was only a sanatorium, which was closed for repairs. However, one wing was really disguised as a clinic. It all turned out to be a sham, and so had Lucy. "I'm afraid we're not going to find Jason anytime soon," Bobby said. Emily told him a prophetic dream, and the fishing cabin did indeed show signs of her husband's presence. But that was the end of it. "I'm divorcing him anyway," Emily decided. She wasn't going to stay in a bond with a man who constantly cheated on her. She wanted to get a job and rent some place to live. Bobby, on the other hand, offered to stay with him for the time being. "But the situation will be ambiguous. I heard your confession," Emily said. "Crippled you," Bobby sighed. Emily decided to see if Bobby still loved her, and for some reason she wanted to believe that he did. "I wasn't going to deny it. Yes, I did and I do. But you can't make nice by force. Live as long as you need to. I'm not calling anyone to my house. You and Sarah seem to have become friends." Bobby revealed his plans. "Well, maybe the situation is ambiguous because I like you too," Emily said cautiously. After she had saved Bobby, it had become clear to her that life was fragile and fleeting, and everything important had to be said as quickly as possible. She'd already wasted almost 10 years of her life on Jason, and this is where it all led. "Emily, look, I proposed to you a long time ago. Do you think this is how we should get married?" Bobby said in response, and he blushed a deep red. Then he stopped talking and couldn't get over it. But a couple months after Emily and her mom moved out and Sarah and the 3 boys showed up at the cop's apartment, Bobby calmed down and even started purring songs under his breath. From that moment on, it was clear to him why he hadn't died in that basement. Now there was clearly someone to live for. No, you don't look so good. We should call an ambulance." "Your cough isn't good," Emily told Sarah another month later, and she wouldn't stop coughing. "I have chronic bronchitis. It's nothing, just a seasonal exacerbation," Sarah brushed it off. When Emily insisted and called an ambulance, the doctor immediately took Sarah to the hospital. A week later, she was gone. It was like a thunderclap. "What did you want?" "The case is very neglected. She worked for years, carried the disease on her feet." The doctor waved his hands. Emily couldn't do anything to help, but she could take care of the babies. Bobby was only too happy for them to get married and adopt the boys. Of course, he blamed himself for not convincing Sarah to move in with him sooner, but she was so stubborn. She kept hoping her common-law husband would wise up, and he didn't even show up for the funeral. Bobby tried to tell him about his sister's death. That's how he found out that he didn't grieve after he left, and immediately got a new lady. His heart didn't stop Brian from drinking, so he was quite happy, although for the sake of appearances he offered to raise a glass for the repose of his soul. He even shed a tear, but Bobby declined. A year later, Emily's mom passed away. A month before leaving, she regained consciousness, began to recognize her daughter, happy that she was expecting a child, and was sure that the other 3 boys are also her own grandchildren. No one began to change the elderly woman's mind. "Daughter, when I am gone, you certainly do not cry. I've lived a good life. And also, go to Daddy's cottage, the one by the lake. I had a dream about my dad today. He said there's a good catch tied up under the bridge," Mom said. Emily thought she was delusional, but promised she would. They talked so much during that month it seemed like never before in their lives. Emily couldn't be happy that she had a mom again who remembered her, but they were only destined for a month of happiness. And then her mom quietly fell asleep and never woke up again. Died early in the morning with a smile on her face. Ashley, don't cry, your mom died happy. She was excited about her grandchildren. They even remembered me and approved of me. Bobby tried to hold back the tears. He felt unbearably sorry that now that they had lived to be happy, such family and friends were gone. I know, Bobby, but I can't help it. You know, I once thought I didn't have a baby just because I had to take care of my mom like a little girl. Maybe it's my fault she's dead. Emily pressed herself against her husband. Oh, don't be silly. You know what? After the funeral, we'll go over to your dad's house like you promised, Mom, Bobby suggested. He figured that the memories of his parents would have a bitter taste in his wife's mouth for a long time to come. So he just had to be patient. He couldn't get over death himself just yet. Still, life was taking its toll. The boys were running wild and his wife was due to give birth to another son. Could he have hoped for such happiness? Jason was finally caught and put behind bars. Except he wasn't about to give up the stash. Bobby knew that Jason wasn't likely to live long in prison because he had deceived a very dangerous man, so one could understand why he kept the secret. It was the last guarantee that he would be allowed to live. Do you remember when Mom said before she died that there would be a good catch under the bridge? I suddenly thought, what if that's where Jason hid the diamonds? Emily said when they arrived at her late father's cabin. You know, it could very well be. He said in the interrogation that he would have finished me off if he'd found it. It's entirely possible Jason had another thing to do here. Bobby began to feel the space under the bridge and almost cut himself on a thin, very inconspicuous fishing line. He pulled on it. Somehow Emily wasn't surprised at all when she saw that there was a polyethylene-wrapped weight tied to it. Transparent rocks. The last thing Jason had left. And for some reason, that was the day he'd been gone for mysterious reasons. He'd fallen, hit himself. Yeah, so unfortunate as to be fatal. That was the official story. Bobby and Emily turned the jewelry into the state, as found treasure and got their rightful quarter. And just in time for the couple to have a son. They named him Ben after Emily's dad. Amazingly, the day he was born coincided with the day his father was born. It's okay to branch out. Let each kid have his own room, Bobby suggested. And just in case he bought a house with a room to spare that could fit at least 3 more kids. And you're an optimist, Emily laughed. But she herself wouldn't mind having more additions over time. Children made her truly happy. It seemed as if all those years before she hadn't lived at all, but just existed next to a man who needed her only as a servant, and a souvenir in one person. Of course, the secret was that there was a man who had loved her for a long time, and to whom she could now reciprocate fully. To Bobby had become her sun that had suddenly risen in the sky and made life meaningful. And that's what she'd said in his ear one day. And her husband replied that if he really was a luminary, he was created only to light up her and the children's lives. Emily knew that wasn't true. Bobby helped tons of people and saved lives every day at work. He was a light to so many. And his wealthy father had talked him out of his dangerous job for nothing. Emily knew her husband would always listen. That's just the way he is. He didn't want security and he didn't want comfort. And she was sure Bobby would live happily ever after because he was loved at home. Jane was annoyed. She had a session coming up, a lot of debts to pay, not a dime to spare, and then there were the funerals. Well, her mother's neighbor, Aunt Clava, called and said that the funeral would be in a day. That's round-trip tickets, return tickets, and probably the cost of the arrangements if Danny or Victoria didn't take care of it. I wonder if they know yet, but to write to her brother or sister, pride wouldn't allow it. Jane decided not to go, not to spend and see the relatives with their sneers and complaints. She's studying anyway, so there's nothing for her to do there. She will come later and sit on the grave. There was no regret or longing on Jane's face. Rather, irritation with a touch of sadness from the disruption of the usual way of life. The relationship with her mother, older brother and sister had been difficult all her life. Her mother molded her into a pretty girl, forbade her to go out and do what she liked, forced to learn lessons, help around the house, iron her school uniform from the evening. The forbidden fruit beckoned from this only stronger. She beat her stubborn daughter for her first cigarette and took away her phone when she saw her kissing a boy at the gate. Her brother called her a naughty girl, and her sister rolled her eyes and clucked her tongue. Eventually, at the age of 16, Jane, fighting with her mother over a bull, snapped and left home. She lived with a guy, finished school, then left with him 500 kilometers away in a large city. She worked for a long time, survived the breakup, but saved up for education, and only at the age of 23 she finally entered the university, when she realized the value and necessity of a diploma and an education. The girl did not maintain relations with any of her relatives. She had enough friends and colleagues. Rumors, of course, came what and how, but Jane purposefully did not look for them. Why? To be rebuked once again? No. Now, Jane did not want to sacrifice even a fraction of what she had worked hard and longed to achieve. She was studying, working, and it was unrealistic to find time for a trip, and she didn't want to be honest. They'll figure it out without me, the girl decided, and moved the outline closer. Her mother had failed to mold a decent girl out of Victoria. Unlike her straightforward younger sister, she had a cunning, dodgy character, went by the head, and was not afraid to use methods that others seemed dirty. So, without much connection or higher education, Victoria became the manager of a small travel agency by the age of 28 in the capital. She had a short haircut and generally looked very apathetic, with tattoos all over her arms, bright makeup and expressive after a visit to the beautician's face. The news of her mother's passing caught Victoria in another country, when she had just checked into a hotel with a girl. The trip was a 10-day trip. Elsa, as a calculating and practical lady, Victoria calculated how much it would cost to have an unplanned return flight and a missing voucher, not to mention a ruined vacation. The decision was obvious: stay and rest. Victoria could make it to her parents' funeral if she wished. She was in a good financial position. But principle intervened in the situation. Her son keys say, "Management is not for women," her mother grumbled. "Manware business is to keep the home and hearth cozy, to keep the money. Let men earn money, it's their natural destiny. We have a different purpose." "What purpose, mother? We're not cogs in an engine. People choose what they want to be," Victoria argued. "It won't do you any good if you go against nature." Mother was adamant. "You've already gone and painted pictures, and it's time to think about your family." Victoria, in her favorite manner, rolled her eyes and sat down. Talking about family, husband, and children had been gagging her since she was in transition. Her mother's old believership pissed her off more than anything else. Inculcating humility and submission ended with the girl doing the opposite. She cut her dresses with scissors, put on jeans and aggressive outfits. Instead of cooking dishes, she chose sketches of future tattoos. Instead of romances for the sake of bouquets and moonlighting, she looked for profitable acquaintances. She knew she wanted to lead, to decide, and to get out of that box of traditional values her mother had stubbornly shoved her into. Of course, by the time she was 28, her dream had come true. Chain of useful connections brought her to the owner of a travel agency. Victoria quickly got a job there, then had an affair with a man and made it so that he reissued the business to her. Behind left a broken life of the ex-wife, a pile of fired, unwanted female employees, and a pile of gossip. But the ambitious girl did not care. Sliams are not judged. As they say, Victoria combined the leadership of the party and constant traveling. At home, she could not survive even cacti, not to mention husbands, children, and dogs. Her self-sufficient, egoistic Victoria loved unrequited only herself and did not want to sputter on anyone else. Postum quickly got rid of the suitor. To take his business was very easy from a legal point of view. Victoria visited her mother's house once a year, or even less often. She was bored at her parents' house. There was no way to manage. Danny was the only one who could hold a horde of kids at attention. When his visits overlapped with Victoria's, Jane ran off with her boyfriend. That left the arguments with his mother, which was nothing new from year to year. To Barbara's chagrin, Helga began to drink and complain about her health. Victoria was eager to get out of her father's house as soon as possible, so as not to cross paths and not to listen to the old woman's complaints. Brother will sort it out himself. He's a man, and he's the eldest, decided the apathetic travel agency boss about the news. She should have gone there a long time ago. God forgive her, and she thought, a little later, but did not say it aloud so that her girlfriend would not hear. If Helga tried to make real women out of her daughters, Then she brought up a real man and her son. But again, everything turned out to be a mess. Danny from a small age was forced almost everywhere to solve his own problems, to stand up for himself and not to roar. If Victoria and Jane's mother was poor with standard feminine admonitions, then from her son she demanded firmness, hardness of character, stubbornness, and determination. This eventually bore fruit. Danny was indeed a leader in the class, the head of the class and the first in studies. But in the shadow of achievements hid callousness of heart, despotism, narcissistic style of behavior, indifference to other people's problems. He could make caustic jokes about ugly classmates who secretly counted on his interested look. Might have snarled at his sisters and his mother herself. Jane, all childhood, hid from her brother in corners when he came home in bad spirits. Did not understand before her other people's tears because of a bad grade or worldly injustice. After school, the guy went into the army and decided to become a military man for good for status and benefits. He married a shy girl from the backwoods, made a child, and by the age of 33 moved with his family to the seacoast. We could only guess what was going on at home with Danny, because his wife did not dare to say a word against him. Only his shadow in a dress looked out from behind her husband's back. It was clear that he cheated on his wife, and in general felt his complete impunity. Danny came home mostly because of some paperwork issues. He knew that his mother had started to drink, but he limited himself to rare duty calls and sending money with the words, "Go to the doctor." He regarded Victoria as a fallen woman, Jane, an outright fool and a loser, and always set himself as an example to them without listening to any arguments. As a result, when all of them were almost separated, communication was reduced first to drying the walls of the house, then to short texts on holidays, and later and completely hushed up, and everyone was satisfied with everything. The neighbor's call came at breakfast. Danny listened to the news with a stony face. He pondered what to do. The death of a relative is a valid reason, and it was certainly possible to leave the service. But first of all, it was a long way to go by airplane. Secondly, he had long ago had no warm ties with his sisters or his mother, only actual blood relation. He hadn't been back home in 2 years and hadn't bothered at all, and here was a funeral, or something akin to longing pricked Danny's heart. But it quickly faded. "Will you fly?" Shyly asked his wife, serving coffee. "No, I'll send money. They will organize themselves there." "Gee," said the man. "No. What about the inheritance?" The wife asked again. Danny suddenly thought about it. "You're right, but we don't know if my mother left a will. And if not, then we already get the house for 3. According to the law, we don't have to break down either. Nowadays, such cases can be solved from a distance." Violet was standing by the fresh pit with a young girl at her side. Besides them, there were about 10 other people at the funeral. Neighbors, friends, and former colleagues of the deceased. They never showed up. Aunt Clava blotted her eyes with a handkerchief and adjusted the black mourning bandage on her head. "Oh, it's not Christian for children not to say goodbye to their mother. We can't make them." The girl sighed, clutching the carnations in her hand. "You're right, Barbara, you're right. Helga brought them up. She put her whole soul into it. But the children have grown up so ungrateful," Violetta complained. "Maybe at least they will visit the grave." At the modest wake, there were many kind words and tears. But not a single person asked Violetta and Barbara why none of the deceased's children were there, and they wouldn't have known what to answer since they had personally called everyone. Or rather, Barbara knew, but she had been too reverent of Helga during her lifetime and too respectful of her memory after her death to explain to each of his residents exactly what the matter was. "Actually, and why are you crying, tell me?" Seriously, Helga looked at her son's red face. The boy rubbed his eyes with his fist and pointed to the sandbox where another boy, a juvenile bully, was having fun with his blue brand new toy truck. "And hide to you, and you're crying. You have to be a man," Helga reprimanded his son. "You'll always be like this. You'll always walk around." Danny sobbed and looked at the offender. "We're saying don't hit first, but if you get hit, hit back." His mother admonished him, "Don't give yours back unless you've been asked," and said, "Please first." Dane sat down on the bench and his 6-year-old brain digested his mother's words. Helga watched the child but was in no hurry to return her son's toy herself. After a couple minutes, Danny stood up, walked over to the sandbox. "Send me back my car, please," he asked the offender. The bully threw sand at Danny instead of answering. The boy at the same moment pounced on Nikita and firmly sealed Barbara on the back of his head with a plastic spatula. Soon a siren sounded again from the sandbox, but from a different source. A crumpled Danny in dirty shorts was proudly carrying the blue truck home. That day he realized something. That brute force works better than the word plea. At the time, his father was still living with him and was also doing his part in raising their first child. He forbade to impose on his son female duties and household chores. Said that a man should learn to earn and fight. Pots to wash and iron the laundry will be his wife. As a result, the boy didn't know how to make a bed or fry scrambled eggs at the age of 9. But he quickly realized his superiority over girls and with this position entered adulthood. His father had an accident and died when Danny was 13, Victoria was 8, and Lil Jane had just turned 2. Max was a quiet tyrant and demanded total obedience from the whole family. Helga wanted her son to respect women and be strong in spirit, but the bad influence of his father had already taken root in the boy's subconscious. Lane saw the broken dishes in the sink, pulled Olga out of the pit after a night's work as a cook. She heard the noise and scolding from the kitchen. "Clean up your own maid." "No," shouted Victoria Yi, pointing her finger at a dirty plate on the table. "That's your job," Danny shrugged and indifferently dropped the dishes on the floor. "Stop it, Yi," Helga shouted at both of them. "They've Victoria. Is it hard for you to clean up and help your brother?" "I'm not a maid to clean up after everyone." The scandalized 10-year-old put her fists at her sides. "He has exams, he's studying, he's tired." "Well, what are you, like a little girl?" She silently picked up a plate from the floor, cleared a second one off the table, cleaned everything up, and turned around. Danny had left the kitchen with a triumphant expression on his face. Victoria breathed noisily, her nostrils flaring wide. "Daughter, you're smarter, you should be softer, more flexible." Putting a hand on her shoulder, Helga said, "I don't want to," Victoria objected. "I don't want to be like you." She stamped her feet and fled to her room, struggling to provide for the children after her husband's death. Helga worked very hard, took more shifts, hadn't been on vacation in years, and still had her own business and garden at home. No personal life, no hobbies, no hobbies. Helga lived for her children and the desire to give them the best. Education, summer camp, clothes, goodies, toys. She bought something for herself when the previous thing wore to holes and tore. One day a woman was getting ready to go to a parent-teacher conference for her son's 11th grade class. Danny looked at his mother. Stompy shoes, a stretchy skirt with an old oil stain, a blouse, and a late 90s fashion jacket. Brave boy wrinkled his nose. "Don't go. I'll say you've been working." He stopped the woman who was about to leave. "Me. Why, son?" "Helga is perplexed. They'll think we're beggars." "Shall we?" Danny replied briefly. "Don't embarrass me, Mom." The woman froze on the doorstep. She had barely gotten off work to hear about her son's progress from the teacher's mouths. Helga turned to the narrow mirror on the exit and glanced at her own reflection. In front of her stood a tired, unpleasant lady with bags under her eyes. "Go get some red." Danny took his mother by the elbow. "Nah, I'm not an underachiever. They won't scold me for sure." But you know what? Helga returned to the room and tears came to her eyes. When Danny left for the army, Victoria was 14 years old. She had hoped her daughters would become her helpers, but the exact opposite had happened. Victoria's transitional age began to appear early, but very clearly. It was immediately clear that her father's genes had left their mark, and here the hysterical girl closed the door on any occasion, roared, and waved her face at her mother's attempts to impute some kind of morality to her. But among her girlfriends and friends, Victoria enjoyed authority and unquestionable power. She was able to expel or punish those she did not like. "You can't do that, my daughter." Helga sighed when she listened to Victoria's boastful stories. "You'll make enemies." "Yes," replied the girl. "You can't do that." "Icon, Deki. Your husband too will be so tormented, and so will run away after a week." "Yes." Shook her head, woman. "Who said I'd even have one?" Victoria folded her arms across her chest. "I'd say," Helga splayed her hands, "and a family. Sooner or later you'll want warmth, comfort, children to nurse. Gross. I've seen enough of you. Thank you, don't. There are more interesting things in life than washing and feeding a baby." The conversation was over. Helga had asked herself many times why the children had grown up to be opposites instead of what she had raised them to be. Instead of love, understanding, and respect in everyone, Helga saw selfishness and self-purpose. Danny remained in the contract service and enrolled as a part-time student at the university to qualify for an officer's rank in the future. He hardly ever called. And when he picked up the phone, he waved off that he didn't have time to talk. By the end of high school, Victoria was more concerned with her own appearance than with grades and exam preparation. She worked part-time at different places to get tattoos and fashionable haircuts. Helga did not know about the first for a long time. The second accepted with a stretch, calming herself with the fact that hair is not teeth and grows. And the pictures on her daughter's body she saw when it was already late. A piece of tattoo popped out from under the sleeve of her t-shirt. "Can you see them?" Victoria asked, watching her mother stare in horror at her arm. "Would you like to see the whole thing?" The girl took off part of her t-shirt. A fiery dragon in mottled colors and bright spots looked at Helga. "No, why? Why? Tell me." The woman sat down frustratedly on a stool. "I wanted it that way." Victoria shrugged her shoulders. "You like it?" "It's not right. You'll be seen as a slutty woman. A decent guy doesn't need a painted girl." "Mom, when you were a child, tattoos were only done in prison and by girls of easy virtue. In your youth, you had to go to school, get married, and have a baby. In your picture of the world, girls wear dresses and boys wear pants. I'm so sick of your lectures." She threw the dirty rag used to wipe the table at the wall and ran back to her room. And in the evening, Victoria ostentatiously dumped her shredded skirts and dresses on the carpet in front of her mother. "Hey, you can't make me wear this now, no matter how much you want to." She angrily kicked the pile of rags into the oven with her feet. Helga didn't argue anymore. She only hastily wiped away a tear when she saw on the pile of rags the blue dress she had bought for her daughter's graduation. Once in a while, Helga was visited by her neighbor Violetta, a vivacious grandmother who also raised 2 children on her own, tended the vegetable garden every season, and kept poultry. Victoria treated Violetta's aunt indulgently. She could treat her aunt to jam. She did not interrogate or teach her. Jane often played with the neighbor's grandchildren and took her well.
"You're looking a little gaunt, Helga. It's time for you to quit this kitchen," Aunt Clava said, stirring her tea with a spoon in her mug.
"So where would you quit?" Helga waved her off. "What are the helpers for? Here, there are 2 growing up." Violetta nodded at the pictures of the girls in frames on the wall. Helga twirled a mug in her hands and gazed at the floating teas. "Clava, I think my children don't like me." She exhaled. "What am I doing wrong?" "Oh, come on." Aunt Violetta waved her hands. "All children love their parents, and yours do too. You do so much for them. A child's individuality should be embraced. His view of the world to encourage, to guide, only a little to support, and how to accept if they break their future life." In her heart, Helga banged her fist on the table so that she spilled the tea. "But it's their life, and you can't protect them from all mistakes." Violetta calmed her down, helping her to wipe puddles from her knee. "The world is changing, and they are changing. You teach them to accept it, but what do you do?" Helga suddenly froze. The neighbor's words poked her in the soul, but it was impossible to admit it. The woman tried to be a caring mother from the position that she herself had seen in her childhood and that she thought was right. "I have 2 boys. Violetta sat back down. "So what do you think? They drank and smoked when they were young and went out and brought bad grades home. But now they're both handsome, both family men. They bring their grandchildren to me on weekends. Real men have grown up." The neighbor clapped her palm on the tablecloth. "I scolded them, of course, in a good way, but I left the right to make mistakes." The woman continued, "If you insulted your friends, you'd get a slap on the neck from them. That's how it's brought up. Only on their own skin they understand. I can't do that." Helga shook her head. Her neighbor took her hand conciliatingly. "And even if you can't, the main thing is that you love them and want the best for them. They'll grow up, they'll understand later. And now let them be sarcastic. Don't take it to heart. Be above the childish antics. They need to prove themselves, spread their tails. Let them." Helga remembered her daughter's tattoo, her son's capriciousness and coldness, and could not understand how one could calmly react to such an attitude from close people. Although it was exactly what the kind-hearted neighbor insisted on. A paradox, no other way. Victoria went to the capital with some Mexican, having drunk her mother's blood at the age of 18. She didn't want to study, but finished some courses in management and administration. Helga had many conversations with her daughter about the necessity of a normal education, but everything was as if she were talking against the wall. Victoria had a different opinion and stubbornly continued to tear down the standardized female image. Jane was growing up too. And at first Helga thought she was a sweet and docile child. She wasn't soulless and narcissistic like her brother. She wasn't selfish and self-centered like her sister. She helped around the house, even though she was reluctant to cook and clean. But since she was 14 years old, she had been thinking only about partying and boys. She often skipped school, went on dates, and hung around with one suitor and another. Teachers called Helga with interrogations and requests to influence her daughter, to no avail. Once Jane long tolerated the moralizing mother and then issued in Simeon, "I want to have fun. It's time for books to go moldy." Helga was shocked by this statement. While Danny and Victoria at least had goals and desires, albeit not quite up to the gold standard, Jane was close to going down a crooked path, and so it happened. One day, Helga found her daughter's pack of cigarettes in a secret pocket of her jacket. Then she burst into her room and yanked Jane right out from under the covers, sleepy. "You're smoking?" yelled Helga at her. "I don't need an ashtray at home." She grabbed her bag strap from her chair and slapped her defensive daughter on the back with it. Helga had never hit a child, except when she was a kid. She might have spanked them lightly. But here it was as if she had snapped. As if in that blow she had unleashed all her anger for the three of them on one. Helga felt a lot of anger at herself for that outburst. Her son's words about Jane, who had been a troublemaker, kept going through her mind. Then Jane didn't speak to her for 4 days. She didn't stop smoking, but she hid it better out of spite. She also stopped doing things around the house, also out of spite. She had a tomboy in her company, an 11th grader and a handsome boy of the breed that drives girls under 20 crazy. Jane was no exception and went into the affair headfirst. Michael studied poorly, but secretly drove her in her dad's car. At night taught her to pour beer without foam and always talked about some murky business with guys. Jane was impressed and dreamed of running away with her lover to the end of the world. So, in the evening, her mother caught them kissing in front of the house on her way home from work. Michael and his family Helga knew perfectly well, rarely earning a living anywhere. Father a drinker and mother a gossip. She elbowed Jane right out of her beau's arms. "Mom, why are you always bothering me?" The daughter flared up. "You should be studying, not cuddling in corners with that bum," Helga said angrily. "I'll deal with it myself. You haven't lived your life. Let others live theirs. You'll figure it out. You'll be a walking winch." Helga felt that her voice was breaking into a croak, and her face was burning with anger and helplessness. How could anyone accept such a thing? How could one accept the deliberate desecration of one's own child's life? Helga didn't understand. Jane wanted to say something but froze. The scandal ended when Helga didn't find her daughter's things at home. Then she called her, wrote to her, asked her to come back, asked her to come to her senses. But Jane said briefly that she now lived on her own and did not need her mother, who considered her a walking winch. So the woman was left alone in the big house. And the other will say that live and be happy, offspring off the neck, but not Helga. No matter how the children treated her, it was harder to come to empty rooms. She called both Danny and Victoria, but they did not like to talk for a long time, citing their busyness. They also came rarely, and not for long. Aunt Violetta came in frequently and somehow brightened the loneliness of her mother. Helga even got a cat to keep her from being bored, but she could only listen and meal back. Soon the long work on her feet and her age, 55 years old, made themselves felt. At the examination, the woman was informed about a whole bunch of problems. Varicose veins, cardiovascular diseases, joints. Gradually, Helga herself did not notice how she began to drink alcohol to brighten loneliness and drown out sad thoughts. Aunt Clava came to Helga's house and found her asleep in the kitchen at the table. The woman roused her. Lately, Violetta was very worried about her neighbor's condition. She had become unsociable and cried all the time. Even the house began to fall into disrepair. Clava tried to visit more often, but she couldn't sit with Helga without staying with her. She was in her 70s. She jumped up, looking around and then shamefully hiding the wine bottle behind the table. "You've had enough of living alone," Violetta said when Helga had cleaned herself up and was preparing breakfast. Who needs me? She waved me away. "Men look at young men and I'm old already." Violetta smiled, though she meant something else. "Men are a matter of time," said the neighbor. "But I think you need an assistant and company." "My helpers are gone," Helga sighed, setting the coca down. One of Violetta's sons often supplied orphanages with things and other help from concerned compatriots. The orphans were supposed to be given apartments under a state program when they reached adulthood. But in practice, some waited years for them, and some did not get them at all. And you had to live somewhere. "There is a girl there," Violetta said. "A pretty girl, but she didn't get an apartment. She gave birth to a baby at the age of 19. Now she is wandering wherever she can. You can't live in a shelter. And you know how hard it is with kids to earn money for a rented place. I feel sorry for the girl."
I still don't understand where you're going with this, neighbor.
Helga listened attentively. "I'm saying that you should take her in with you. You could help her with household chores and she wouldn't be bored. And you'll do a good deed. You won't have to work forever. And I'd get her a job as a nanny in a kindergarten," Violetta finished. She didn't like the prospect of letting a stranger with a child into her house. But on the other hand, Violetta was right. She was already going crazy with loneliness. It couldn't get any worse. Victoria looked irritably at the mud on her new shoes, the dirt of her hometown, where she'd fallen into when she'd barely gotten out of the cab. "Sweet home," the girl muttered through gritted teeth. Victoria was not going to stay here for a long time. The next day, she already had a plane to the capital, and Barbara stayed in a hotel. She was preparing herself morally for the meeting with her relatives, her older brother and younger sister. After all, for the first time in many years, they were all to gather together in the notary's office for the announcement of her mother's will. The news of it came as a great surprise. Victoria had assumed that the house would go to the three of them in equal shares according to the law of inheritance, but not so. The girl was tormented by a bad feeling. The call with the news again took her by surprise during the return from vacation. Now there was no way to get out of it. Who knows what her mother, who was obsessed with correctness, would write in her will, and the very fact of its existence was a moderately pleasant surprise. There was nothing to do. I had to go back on board the airplane. It was not, after all, to leave all of her mother's possessions to her relatives. Victoria even thought over in her head how she could competently take away their parts of inheritance from her brother and sister. She even called familiar lawyers, who were frequent visitors in her travel agency, but they only shrugged their shoulders, saying that a closed will is a cat in a bag, and some schemes can be offered only after its announcement. The notary's office was located near the center and near the entrance. From afar, Victoria noticed a familiar figure with an army dressing. Quietly, she prepared to greet her brother. "Hi, you're still the same," she said as she approached him. "Hi, I can't say the same for you," Danny glared at his sister. He didn't like her haircut, nor the tattoos already on both arms peeking through the translucent blouse, nor the lemon-colored stiletto shoes and red pants. Victoria appreciated the look and rolled her eyes, but quickly regained her coolness and neutral expression. They exchanged short phrases about life, weather, and nature and waited for the last participant of the meeting. Surprisingly, there was almost no longing or sadness in the words of these people, only poorly concealed irritation at the need to disrupt the usual. No one even thought of going to the cemetery to say goodbye to the deceased. Probably mocking his younger sister was the only thing he and Danny had in common. Soon a cab pulled up in front of the office. A frazzled Jane jumped out of it in a hurry. Her hair was pulled back into a ponytail, her crumpled t-shirt poking out of her jeans. "I guess you were right," Danny whispered in Victoria's ear, eyeing her relative contemptuously. "You're late to see," Victoria said, without greeting or ceremony to her younger sister's face. No, I nudged and Jane snapped back. "But it's not my fault the bus took so long." Victoria rolled her eyes again and pushed her bangs aside. "Pardon, Metty," Danny said in a whisper, already pulling open the door. "Have more important things to do right now." The notary, looking like a business canary, sat everyone down in chairs. "Well, first of all, my condolences for your loss. Losing a mother is a great blow." "I'm sorry," Danny cut him off. But we're busy people. We don't have much time." "We're busy people. We don't have much time." The notary nodded ceremoniously and asked for the testator's death certificate. Danny pulled the document out of his briefcase and handed it to him. The man ran his eyes over the papers, assured something, made a short note, and finally pulled an envelope out of his desk drawer. He showed his signature and the date on it. My mother must have felt it. The document was drawn up 6 months before she went to the next world, Victoria whispered, not addressing anyone in particular. The second envelope was also drawn up according to all the rules, with the signatures of 2 witnesses and the notary himself. In one of the signatures, Victoria recognized the hand of her neighbor Enclava.
The envelope was opened, and finally, the necessary paper lay on the notary's desk. The deceased's will was written on an ordinary yellowed sheet of paper from an old notebook, which did not fit the office and the situation. While the notary read out the text, Victoria nervously tapped her fingernails on the phone screen. She was holding a candy wrapper in her hands, and Danny was crunching his knuckles. Everyone understood the importance of the moment and waited. The notary looked up at the audience and paused expressively.
Bequeath all my property to Barbara Miller. There was such silence that a fly could be heard crawling on one of the folders on the far shelf. Then furry, take it there is no Miller here. The notary looked equally surprised at the young people, to which Victoria jumped up first from her chair. Who the hell's Miller? What the hell kind of mess is going on with your people anyway? She rushed to the table, wanting to see for herself if what she had heard was a mistake or a joke. But her mother's handwriting said exactly what she'd heard. None of the names that the 3 children Helga had put in the will, as the complex signature at the bottom with its many curlicues testified. Victoria remembered from high school trying to copy it in her diary and failing miserably each time. Per se, we're not going to let it go. Danny threatened the notary, who also wanted a bigger piece of the inheritance. Yeah, sue all you want. The notary shrugged it differently. My case is done. Oh, and don't forget the copies. Under the puzzled, lost, somewhere angry looks of those present, he made 3 copies of the will, certified them, and handed them to everyone in turn. I have a son growing up. He needs a place to live too. Danny emphasized the word Satan. I need to invest in business. You'll earn a bed for your son yourself. I don't have an apartment at all. I live on a rented one. Jane shouted, listening to her brother and sister squabble. Both of them stared at her with such eyes that it became clear. They were ready to get rid of the 3rd applicant for the inheritance right here. Jane squeezed her head cowardly into her shoulders. The bickering under the door of the notary's office continued. Everyone realized that a quick resolution of the case would drag on for an incomprehensible period of time and incur costs and nerves. Meet Barbara. And this is her son. Violetta introduced Helga to the girl standing modestly on the doorstep. She had a 1-year-old baby in her arms and a small plaid bag. She was poorly dressed, but she had a thick shoulder-length blonde braid and huge blue eyes that still held a certain childlike naivete and belief in miracles. Helga remembered how children had looked at her with those same eyes a long, long time ago. Clava nudged the hesitant girl into the room. When the guest had gone, the neighbor asked, Helga, what are you like? As if you were not your own. You're a good girl. Have I ever deceived you? It's good, Helga said. But I'm not used to it. I need to look at it more closely. Helga looked at her for a couple of weeks. At first, conversations between the new acquaintances were awkward. Violetta, as promised, immediately arranged for the girl to work in a kindergarten. This way, she could look after her baby and earn a little money. In the house, Barbara did not manage much, only asked short questions about cleaning and other household trifles. The baby did not disturb her and was quite quiet. The awkwardness is gone thanks to His Majesty, Chance. Not again back. Barbara said loudly as she opened the door. The landlady's shoes were in their place, but she herself could not be heard. She cautiously entered the room, put the cradle with her son on the armchair, and found Helga still napping on the floor next to her. Barbara rushed over to the woman and started to bring her to her senses. Helga opened her eyes and looked around awkwardly. She had promised herself every day for the past 6 months that she would never buy wine again, never lock herself in a room and drink, until the pang of emptiness was filled. But coming back from her shift, her feet carried her to the store and her gut demanded relaxation. Helga guessed that Violetta had insisted on Barbara's move and knew about her neighbor's addiction and was worried, and everyone also realized that Helga's children didn't care about her. They are busy with their own lives, and Mahum will put their mother in rehab for a little while. Helga, what are you doing? Barbara anxiously looked into the woman's eyes. Your blood pressure, your heart isn't right. And you're drinking? Helga tolerated it. The girl shamed her. Justifiably, though. And then the unexpected happened. The accumulated tension, longing, sadness overflowed the cup and tears spilled out. Helga buried herself in Barbara's chest and burst into tears. The girl fell into a stupor for a couple of seconds, and then embraced the woman and began to caress her back and comfort her as if she were a small child. I've always dreamed of having a big family, the landlady said while Barbara poured tea. I wanted to be a mom. I played mother-daughter all my childhood, read fairy tales about princesses. Mom did not allow to go out with boys, taught to be meek, malleable, soft, or told me to take care of myself or my husband. And I looked at them and my father and thought that I would also have a warm family atmosphere and respect, a hot dinner in the evenings at a big table. But our table was small, and the apartment was only 2 rooms. Helga sniffed her nose like a schoolgirl. Barbara put the cups on the table and sat down on a stool next to her, watching her son, who was beginning to fall asleep. I always thought my husband was the pillar, the wall, but wise. That's how I lived until I met Max. I fell madly in love, but I didn't see who. Helga continued. I got pregnant with Danny, we got married, and then Max moved us here to this house. I realized I was in a fairy tale. The woman grinned and sipped from her mug. Not the fairy tale I'd read, though. I thought I was a princess, but it turned out to be Cinderella. You would know how much I crawled here on my knees, pregnant, cleaning the floors, windows, and mirrors every day. Free meals with my belly. First, second, and compote. Barbara listened without interrupting. My husband worked, got a good salary, we had enough. But he demanded perfect cleanliness and housekeeping. And I was happy to work like a horse. I loved hard. I caught rare moments of tenderness from him after reproaches for dirty tables or unpalatable cutlets. I thought it was my own fault. Then my son was born. I went into motherhood, began to raise myself a troop. Plain bad things stick easier and faster. We all know that. And so instead of a good son grew a copy of her husband, who thought that a woman only should. Oh, his poor wife now. Poor girl. I'm so sorry for her. Helga sniffed her nose again and hastily took a napkin out of the napkin holder. It's not your fault. Barbara intervened gently. You did everything you could to make the child happy. Bad example and bad upbringing played a part. I wanted to raise my son to be a noble, kind, and just man like his grandfather, Helga explained with a sigh. It's a shame he spent so little time with his grandson and left early. If only it had been otherwise, if only it had been. My love, care, and participation were taken for granted by my husband and later by my son. I realized this many years later. I didn't see my mistakes then and made the same mistakes with my daughters. Albert dozed ridiculously in the stroller with his arms spread out. Helga got up to cover the baby with a blanket. Barbara did not disturb her. When I got pregnant, my husband demanded that I contribute to the family budget. So I ran headlong into whatever job I could get. We're a family, although mentally, he ate me up every single day. And then I found out he was cheating. I cried to my mother, looking for support. She said that everyone is like that. Bear with it, the main thing is children. He'll go for a walk and come back. So I learned that not such a noble man was my own father. Just my mother was wise and did everything to make me see the perfect picture. It was already getting dark outside the window. A fine October rain began to cover the windows. A rooster was crowing loudly for some reason at the neighbor's house 2 houses away. Barbara wrapped the curtains and carefully took Albert into his room to put him to bed, promising that she would be back soon. When the new neighbor carefully tiptoed into the kitchen, Helga was already making tea for the 2nd time. And I did a new stupid thing, the landlady continued. I forgave him, just like my mother said. Why, young naive? I was only 26 years old. Husband realized that he has full power over me and can, in Jane's situation, to remain unpunished. He scolded me for every speck of dust, for the laundry, for the kids' mess. And I obediently tolerated and only scolded myself, that bad hostess, bad mother, bad as a woman. And then the 3rd pregnancy. I decided to leave, hoping for miracles once again. But no. My husband was stricter in bringing up the girls scolded for any disobedience, even the tiny Jane. And for some reason I pushed, clogged their heads with marriage, correctness, wise femininity. Oh, if only I had realized before, if only I had realized. Helga moved her eyes to the ceiling and blinked often, stopping the tears that came to her lashes. And when my husband crashed with his mistress, as I found out later, it was as if the rope around my neck had loosened. I wondered if I should be sad and cry. No. Even though I had to work harder, I was glad, but for now only Barbara, that no one else would come to my bed from under someone else's skirt. Barbara moved closer, lightly hugging Helga, whose shoulders were shaking. I wanted so much to raise sweet, affectionate girls. But with my compulsion, I raised a selfish girl, and I realized my mistakes only when they all left. And I, aging, lonely, and none of them needed. Helga, don't be so nervous. Barbara's calm strokes on my back were soothing. All people make mistakes, but there are no mistakes that can't be corrected. You did what you knew how to do. You loved and cared for them as best you could and knew how. I'm sure it's worth talking to everyone and everything can still be saved. Oh, my dear, do you think I didn't try when consciousness overtook me? Helga sighed. I called, I wrote, I invited them to visit. They waved me off, said they were busy. The only thing I achieved was a couple of meetings with my grandson and money for medicines and I decided to go to myself, but they stopped me. I put up with it, tried to understand, tried to justify them, but I knew I was fooling myself. I was burning with this feeling of helplessness in front of those I had created. I broke down. Yes, I started drinking. It's the only way I can dull for a while the pain of not being needed by my children. You spent your whole life giving yourself and your joy to your husband, your children, strangers. Have you ever been truly happy? Barbara asked cautiously. I don't remember. The woman was silent for a long time before answering. I was happy for my son's grades, for my husband's success, for the fact that the children ate well and didn't get sick. That's not it, Barbara said. Although, as a mom, I understand you, I am also happy when Albert eats and sleeps well, but this is different. When you were happy for yourself, were you inwardly, sincerely happy? This time Helga was silent for a long time, trying to search for such a long-forgotten feeling in her memory. And she found it only in childhood, when her mother brought her a small kitten from work. Helga played with it for a long time, cherished and stroked the animal. I think I have long forgotten what it is. She answered quietly. Many people forget, but it is very important to keep the ability to be happy at any age. Barbara smiled. Let's learn again. Me, come on. Surely the neighbor knows who this Barbara is, Victoria reasoned, sitting in the cab, once again cursing at the lack of asphalt and the dirt of her hometown. When the fervor for arguing at the notary's office wore off, the trio decided to go to Aunt A's house. She called with the sad news she was also a frequent visitor to her mother, and her signature was on the envelope with the will. Victoria, Jane, and Danny agreed that it was her they should ask first. There wasn't much time. Everyone had business to attend to in town. I wanted to resolve the difficulties as quickly as possible. But that was not the case. Not only that the situation became tense, but also periodic jokes and sarcastic clues to each other added fuel to the fire. They caught the neighbor at home. Victoria, without ceremony, was beating her fist right through the wicket. Aunt Violetta came out. Hello, hello. She greeted the unexpected guest in a childish way. And I've been waiting, wondering when you'll show up, you shameless people. Violetta, let's not be moralistic. Victoria grumbled and tried to go through the gate. Aunt Clava put aside her club and threatened the girl. You have no conscience at all for not coming to your mother's funeral. And you opened 2 wills, and then you came galloping in. The neighbor continued to reprimand the brother and sisters standing by the fence. It's the law. Danny couldn't stand it and raised his voice. You've grown up. You have epaulets on your shoulders, but you've never become a man. Danny opened his mouth in amazement. They remembered the neighbor as God's dandelion, who never said a rude word, brought them sweets and candies. Let's put down what you think of us. Answer one question of ours and we will never see each other again, said Victoria. Suddenly, a girl peeked out of the kitchen window of a house which overlooked the wicket range. And Violetta, what's all the shouting? It's all right. Go and put Albert to bed. I'll be right then, the neighbor replied. Victoria's eyebrows went up by themselves. Just a moment. But it was too late. Aunt Violetta slammed the wicket doors shut with a vigor unprecedented for an elderly woman. There was a squeal from Jane, whose fingers had been nailed, followed immediately by Danny's swearing. Blanches with the company realized that no one else was going to talk to them here. Their mother's pig-headed attitude played its part. Victoria and Danny took some documents and things from their once home, and then all 3 of them left for their own cities. Here you go, Barbara, smiling radiantly, handed Helga a cotton candy on a stick. And the woman was so confused she looked at both of them on her day off. A small circus was performing in the local park, and Barbara, under the pretext of going for a walk with Albert, dragged Olga out to go there. Let's go. She jokingly hurried Helga already on the threshold. In the last warm days of October, it is simply a crime to stay at home. The woman hesitated at first, but then she agreed. Helga caught herself thinking that it had been a long time since she had taken a walk like that, or her routes were calibrated for a specific purpose. Work, home, store, hospital. She had somehow forgotten that you could just wander aimlessly for fun chatting with someone and not looking at your watch all the time. Huge maples were dropping a carpet of leaves on the sidewalk. Birch trees were swaying their soft branches, where, like a scattering of coins, the leaves were turning golden. In the flower beds, late velvets and dahlias bloomed with a shaggy pom-pom, and only the fir trees stood unperturbed in green patches among the October orange-red palette. Helga even admired the landscape, breathing in the still warm but already damp air soaked with autumn dampness. She remembered long-forgotten feelings of calm, joy, silent, quiet delight, when vanity seemed to be wiped away like dirt from glass. "Did you enjoy the performance?" Barbara asked. "Yes. I haven't been to a circus in probably 20 years, Guy admitted. Never thought I could go to a circus without a reason and without my children. Many things are fun to do without an occasion." Barbara supported her, fixing Albert's cap. "Whoever said you need an occasion to have fun?" Helga looked at her either with respect or with sudden insight. "You know, Barbara, you're not at all what I thought you were," she admitted. The girl laughed. "What did you expect? A sissy, but with a strong character." "Well, not exactly." Helga faltered awkwardly. The question had stumped her. Barbara wiped the baby's applesauce-smeared hands, put him back in the stroller, and said, "I went to the orphanage as an adult. At the age of 12, I already knew what it was to starve, what it was to hide from a drunken father in the basement. I learned to appreciate joyful moments. And in the shelter, she realized that if you cry all the time, you can go crazy." Helga listened eagerly to her companion. It was amazing how Barbara's appearance did not match her strong core inside. However, it was carefully hidden from prying eyes. "And then I thought, why do we only rejoice on holidays? I mean, why do we do that? Gifts, surprises. Why are we trapped in this stereotype?" Barbara continued. "I started to break it as best I could. First, I made paper cranes for all the children in the orphanage, and then I figured out how to sew beautiful outfits from the things that were donated to us. We even organized a fashion show once." Helga laughed. She was surprised at how much fortitude and courage to appear different was in this fragile girl. "I liked what I was doing, and I saw that joyful moments are very much needed all around, from small to great. The students reached out to me, and of course someone fell in love with me," Barbara sighed. "It was a spontaneous feeling, an impulse inspired by my idea of joy in the midst of grayness. But now I have this bell." She patted Albert affectionately on the top of his head. But all is never well." She glanced meaningfully at Guy. "And when I turned 18, I found myself with a baby outside the orphanage. They wanted to leave him there, but I didn't allow it. I didn't wait for an apartment and somehow rented a room in a communal house on my cleaning lady's salary and child allowance. That's how I fully realized how important it is to be happy that you just live and perhaps help others to live." "Did you go to work with children?" Helga suddenly guessed. "Yes." Barbara nodded. "Children still know how to enjoy the little things. In adults, everything is drowned in routine, in some stereotypes and invented frameworks. We drive ourselves into a cage where there is nothing but vanity, problems, and fears. There are very few people who in adulthood can genuinely rejoice and see the beautiful things around them." She threw her scythe and pointed with her hand to a woodpecker on the trunk of one of the maples. Helga also noticed the red-backed bird, which was busily hopping along the bark. "You have welcomed me into your home. You have been kind, and I want very much to help you enjoy life again," Barbara said. "And you're starting to be good at it." Helga hugged the girl, hiding her wet eyes from her. It had been a month since that conversation in the kitchen that evening. Helga had forgotten the last time she'd had a drink. Her house felt cozy and bright again, in a way it probably never had been before. Maybe because both women needed this coziness and both tried to maintain it. Evenings were spent in conversation over fragrant tea or in walks. Barbara told Helga about everything. The woman was amazed at how broad the girl's horizons were and how much she had missed in her life. One day, the company wandered into the evening park again, and some guy gave both of them a rose. Helga was so embarrassed that she didn't know where to put the flower. She finally wanted to go home in the evening, cook something delicious, play with Albert, listen to Barbara. It was amazing how dear this girl, a stranger by blood, had become to her, and Clava sometimes came to visit and watched more and more how Helga had revitalized, how her cheeks were flushed and her eyes had the sense to live. It was as if Helga had gained a daughter and a grandson during this time, and there was no talk of rightness or marriage. How easy it turned out to be to accept a person with his special views and experience. And even if Barbara cooked soup differently, cut bread thickly, and washed floors the old-fashioned way, squatting, Helga no longer wanted to argue, to correct, to teach. And it was not indifferent humility, but the very acceptance she had always imposed on her daughters, imposing what she herself did not understand. One day at lunchtime, two men in overalls knocked on the gate of Helga's house. The landlady came out, looking behind the gate in surprise. Barbara was putting Albert down for his afternoon nap. Hello, we're with the utility. We're checking the wiring for meter connections. They introduced themselves and shoved some form under Helga's nose, which she didn't have time to look at. Everything is legal. She stretched out in confusion. If it's legal, we'll check the wear and tear of the wires. What if you have a leaky roof? The risk of fire due to a short circuit is important. One of the guests raised a finger and very determinedly put his foot in the yard. All right. The woman stepped aside, allowing the worker to pass. The repairman began to inspect the wires and their location, then looked at the pole with serious faces, scratched the back of their heads, wrinkled their brows, and as a result they said, "You have one wire here that is not connected to the meter." "Yeah, and the coating on it's worn off. We should cut it off and see if there's any sign of a short circuit." "I don't think there's any shorts. The TV works. The bulbs are intact." Helga shrugged. "You can tell the firemen the same thing later," one of the men told her indifferently. The woman had no choice but to let the workers into the house, and they started to make a lot of activity. They began to climb along the sockets, picking at the plafond, looking into the switchboard, studying how the wires were laid, and they didn't even take off their dirty shoes. Helga only sighed. 10 minutes later, one of the workers came to her again, and with a sorrowful face said, "Mistress, there was a leak in the ceiling near the switchboard, and the outlets are not grounded. You need to repair, or it will strike, especially in the rain, and that's it." He even made scary eyes to convince me. "How can it be? How many years I've lived and everything is calm." Helga only splashed out with her hands. "So many years you live, and it will happen tomorrow." Continued to scare her interlocutor. Suddenly his partner came out of the corridor, and Barbara came out with a telephone in one hand and a heavy glass carafe in the other. "We don't need to change anything," she said sternly, shaking the chart. "We didn't call anyone. No. What are you doing, girl?" "We came to fix the malfunctions," waved his hands at the man in blue overalls. "Or troubleshooting that you just made up yourself. Get out of here, or do I call the police?" Barbara showed the dialed number on the screen. The men put their heads back into their shoulders and looked at each other apprehensively. Helga was dumbfounded, but her hand instinctively rested on the table, where the old ladle she had recently used to pour soup for lunch was nearby. These, so to speak, electricians, came without tools, without papers, and with a piece of paper from the internet. Call and have them picked up. After these words, the men rushed out of the house, so much so that they almost took the door. Helga only had time to hear from the yard through the window, "You said it was a woman living alone." Dear, when her heart calmed down and her breathing became steady again, Helga was already sitting at the table waiting for Barbara to put a sedative in her glass. "How did you realize they had come?" she asked the girl. "I saw and heard from the window how you let them in, and I noticed at once that they came without tools. Electricians don't just walk around like that, and they won't come unless you call them." Barbara was watching the drops on the neck of the vial, and then one of them dropped the paper they were shoving in your face, and then it was clear. She set the glass in front of Helga, pulled a crumpled piece of paper out of her pocket. It was a crookedly scanned installation permit from 3 years ago. "Oh," the woman sighed. "What would I have done without you?" "Obviously would have been left with no savings," that Barbara answered bluntly. "But everything turned out fine. But let's change the locks on the gate and the door. You never know." Relations with the women became almost kin to each other. Barbara made friends from the young staff of the kindergarten. She sometimes asked Olga to babysit her son while she took time to go to the hairdresser's or to buy some small things. Helga was only happy to take care of Albert. She even thought of him as her grandson. How different these happy moments were from the few miserable hours she was allowed to spend with her blood grandson. Danny and his wife were always criticizing her for everything and literally ripping the child out of her arms. It was different with Albert. He happily assembled with Helga-colored pyramids of rings, threw cubes and balls, learned to walk, supported by a caring woman. Barbara sometimes came and watched from around the corner how reverently Helga treated her son. Everyone understood everything, and everyone needed it. One evening, the girl came into the kitchen to take the baby from the landlady and noticed a slight sadness on her face. "No. What's wrong?" Barbara asked worriedly. "My heart aches for my own children," Helga sighed. "I wish we could communicate with them the way we do with you, about everything in the world, at least on the phone. They haven't called or written to me in 6 months. Jane ignores me completely." Barbara thought about it. "I think you can try to mend your relationship with your children. It just takes patience. I've put up with an overbearing husband my whole life. I'm sure I have enough patience." Helga looked at the girl seriously, her to take the phone in her hands and write to her children. These thoughts caused a stupor in the woman and the fear of a new rejection of contact. It was so strange. She both wanted and feared it. And then Helga pushed the heavy thoughts out with an effort and began to remember the fall walk in the park and after the circus show. She imagined going there with Victoria or Jane. Finally, having tuned in enough, Helga dialed her eldest daughter's cell phone and, "Hello." Victoria's voice came through after a series of long beeps. "Hello, Victoria, ESC." Helga exhaled, gathering her strength. "How are you doing?" "I'm fine. Why are you calling?" Her daughter's voice became suspicious. "Do you want me to send money for the doctor or something?" "Hey, no, daughter. I just want to talk to you." "Well, you talk. I'm listening." Agreed on the other end of the line. Something rustled in the phone. A knowledgeable person would have immediately realized that the call was put on speakerphone. "Victoria, you and I have never understood each other," Helga began. "It's probably my fault. I imposed what I was unhappy with without realizing it. Please forgive me, but now I realize my mistake and I want to know how you live and breathe. I want us to be able to talk like girlfriends and not hold a grudge. Are you okay with that?" There were clicks, distant mumbling, rustling. "Why are you talking to your girlfriends?" Victoria's voice came from somewhere, as if from far away. "Did Aunt Violetta come or what?" Then it became clear that the girl is settling some work issues on another phone. "Yes, we're chatting." Helga's lips quivered. "Bye, daughter." She pressed the cancel button and cried, covering her face. Barbara rushed to comfort the poor woman, but she sobbed like a wounded animal. "Oh, I'm an old fool." And Helga scolded herself through her sobs, hoping for a miracle. "Who needs me with my morals?" "I do. Let's try again." Helga looked at her dejectedly, smearing her tears. A little later. "Yes?" Barbara corrected herself, nodding cautiously. Like the disappointment and sadness left Olga alone only by evening. She realized that one attempt was not enough, that more would be needed, and already the first one had cut her soul with a knife. It was even scary to call Danny. He was the most callous and cold-blooded of all three. The woman didn't even know what words to choose for such an important conversation with her son. Only Barbara's closeness, her support, sincerity, and participation gave Helga strength and determination. Danny picked up the phone immediately. Unlike Victoria, his clear, service-trained flesh went through the house even from the tiny speaker. "Hello, son." Helga began. "I wanted to." "Mom." "Hurry up," Danny interrupted her irritably. "I've got things to do." "What's up?" Nothing. The woman let her eyes droop sadly. "I won't bother you then." "Yeah, go ahead," came from the other end. "We'll try again later. We can't give up." Barbara comfortingly took Helga's hands in the palm of her hand. The woman was no longer crying after the second call, but there was a look of detachment in her eyes. "Barbara, I don't think it's any use. They're adults, and they've gotten used to ignoring me so long ago that it's too late to re-educate them. And your youngest, Jane? She's a little older than me." Barbara wondered. "I don't know her contacts on," Olga said, embarrassed. "She blocked me everywhere after the fight. I only know that she lives in the city and is studying. Well, at least some channel of communication should have been left." Barbara wouldn't stop. Suddenly, Helga jumped up and, muttering something, hurried into the room. She rummaged through the dresser for a long time, then pulled out a dusty diary. Among the recipes, notes on how to properly wash cotton, and phone numbers, the woman found her daughter's email address. She had used this address once, in high school. How did I not remember before? "It's better than nothing," Barbara approved. "We'll think of something to write tonight. In the meantime, maybe we'll have ice cream." "Ice cream in December." Helga smiled. "Why not?" Barbara winked at her. "Who says you can't?" The mood would immediately become better. Just what the doctor ordered on such a gloomy day, with these words. The girl went to the freezer for a briquette of plombier. Helga watched. She realized that Barbara was trying her best to keep her spirits up, but her motherly heart would still ache. Even though she'd become like her own daughter, she couldn't undo the mistakes of the past alone. It's amazing how sometimes common troubles can draw even sworn enemies together and reconcile them. After returning to their respective towns, Victoria, Jane and Danny started a general chat room where they discussed their contested will. It took a couple weeks to figure out Barbara's identity and get the story from the outside. With a squeak, the company agreed to split the inheritance evenly between the three of them. Nevertheless, Victoria pestered the lawyer with inquiries about how to legally competent to pull off more. The poor boy was already regretting that he had tangled with her and mentally cursed all the gods who had once invented the court and inheritance. It's interesting, answered Danny, some left-handed wench with a child living on the dole. For a year, and she's had her mommy described to her for it. What kind of a ride of unprecedented generosity is that? Like NK, I live like that too, and suddenly in a year or two with an apartment. Jane finished. Victoria clicked her pen irritably. The situation pissed her off. The world of tranquility, dimensionality, stable income, partying and vacations shook because of this idiotic will. Now by the efforts of her mom, it is necessary to fuss, spend money. Yes, relatives know how to put a pig under the door, she stretched under her breath. Communication with her brother and sister was annoying, Danny with the baby, Jane with the lack of a place to live. Barbara and Albert had gone to daycare, and Helga had just returned from a night shift as a cook. For weeks the woman had been plagued by vague premonitions. She had been thinking for a long time, deciding, calculating something in her mind, weighing it up, but Barbara had said nothing. With the woman shuddered, thought it over a few more times, and went to her neighbor. "Violetta, I want to write a will," she blurted out, sitting down in front of her. "No, God be with you, Helga." Aunt Clava waved her hands. "Are you going to die?" "I have a premonition. I feel that I must do it now." When Aunt Clava stopped yapping about the neighbor's statement, she clarified. "No, I've been planning for a long time, but I think I'm doing the right thing." "When?" "Well, so you need to call a notary if you're thinking about it." "Yes, without him the procedure can't be done." Helga confirmed. Most of the women called the notary's office and made an appointment. The notary said that 2 witnesses would be needed. "Don't tell Barbara, please," Helga asked her neighbor before leaving. "Like so, I thought we were going to use her as a second witness." The neighbor splashed her hands. Helga shook her head. "We can't have her. We can't have her, Fada, thought. Tay have a son coming in those days. Maybe him." Helga nodded in agreement, said goodbye to her neighbor, and went home with a slightly relieved heart. And the day before, she had spent a long time composing something else. An email to her youngest daughter, and had written a lot of pages. Using Barbara, she created herself a mailbox and slowly retyped the text onto the selection. It had been a week since it had been sent, but the inbox was just as sad and empty. Barbara had said that sooner or later her daughter would reply something, a single word. Helga tried to believe. She generally tried to notice more good things around her. It became an acute, daily necessity on the way to get rid of the colossal feelings of guilt and resentment towards herself, her children, and life. And at times Helga felt she was succeeding. In the polyotestrisha, in the gleam of the sun, in the warmth of a mug of fragrant tea passed from hand to hand, she gathered the grains of her medicine. And next to her was the one who always supported and protected the fragility of her recovering soul. Victoria enlisted all her connections and hired the best lawyer available to challenge her mother's will as soon as possible. It took several months, but the girl achieved her goal. The court confirmed that, as direct heirs of the first term, the native children of the deceased, the 3 of them, Victoria, Danny, and Jane, have legal rights to receive all the property of the mother. However, the second part of the plan could not be realized. The inheritance was awarded equally to each. And nothing. Victoria rubbed her hands together as she left the courtroom. "We'll do our own thing here. That's what the bossy travel agency boss used to do when legal methods were exhausted." Couple of conversations. Hit the right pain points. Intimidate, gather dirt. What difference does it make how she gets what she wants? Danny and Jane didn't show up at the trial. The former cited duty, the latter the cost to travel. Victoria alone represented the interests of the 3. Although the interest here was rather entirely hers, and the relatives were notified of the entry into the inheritance by registered letters from the lawyer. He fought over the ways of action. how to force the fool's brother and sister to sell the mother's property as soon as possible so as to hide from them a part of the income from the transaction. Victoria's plans were Napoleonic. She had long yearned to open a second branch of the agency, to exchange her one-bedroom for a two-bedroom closer to the center and, of course, to go to the United States. Unfair division of money, unfavorable relatives. Victoria did not care. What was to say about a strange girl with a strange child? Neither Barbara nor Aunt Clava were present at the trial. The elderly woman and the young mother had no opportunity to go to the capital, although they knew what was going on. Barbara was stunned when she learned that Helga had left her all their property. The girl was very confused. She experienced two shocks in a month, first from Helga's death, then from her will. The woman passed away in her sleep. She had a heart attack. Barbara found her on her bed when she returned from work. It was 2 months after the will had been written. Helga sensed and was not wrong, unfortunately. Jane's soul was warmed by the news that Victoria had contested the will, and now the three of them were the rightful owners of the house, land, and garage. Jane was tempted to look for a cozy apartment in the suburbs. She was already dreaming about moving there, what kind of repairs she would make, what kind of sofa she would buy. All the farthest school folders of the laptop were dug through and through. Nothing could be found through the system search either. Jane was already nervous, imagining a sleepless night of preparing essays, but her memory obligingly suggested that she had sent her work to the teacher's mailbox in the 10th grade. She had to remember the password to a long, unused mailbox. After a lot of manipulation, Jane managed to log into the account. She began to scroll through her inbox with interest. Mostly they were advertising offers, letters from some sad scammers, archival photos with her classmates. Stop. What is it? Suddenly, a letter from an unfamiliar address caught Jane's eye. It was strikingly different from everything else that had accumulated in her email box for so many years. And the letter was not so old. It had been sent a little less than 8 months ago. My eyes ran along the lines, indifferently at first, but with each word I read, interest, anxiety, embarrassment, realization, and shame grew like a snowball. My daughter, how are you there? I don't know whether you will read my letter or not, but still I hope for the former. I want to ask your forgiveness for everything from beginning to end, for the upbringing you disagreed with, for my desire to mold you into a copy of myself and condemn you to the same torment, for not paying attention to your inner world, and for the abyss that separated us that evening at the courtyard, turning into years of silence and coldness. I hope you'll forgive me. I didn't realize my mistakes until years later. But I don't blame any of you three. You grew up to be who you grew up to be, and I'm still secretly proud of you all. But we've made so many mistakes. Resentments, misunderstandings, harshness, rudeness have divided us all as if we were strangers. How many of your happy moments I missed and didn't see, for which I now blame myself terribly? I wouldn't have dared to write to you, my daughter, if I hadn't had help. I met a girl who opened my eyes and showed me what I'd been depriving myself of all the years of your childhood. I finally have the strength to admit it. I realize I'm asking the impossible, but let's try to become just a little closer as family people. I hope with all my heart for a speedy reply. Your mom, Helga. Jane read out the letter. Her lips jumped, her shoulders shook. She threw herself back in her chair and burst into tears. These pure and sincere words of her mother burned out all the years of resentment from Jane's soul. That night, the girl did not sleep. She forgot about the essay, about her studies. She forgot that she had to go to her classes the next day. Jane sat on the floor of the room against the wall until morning, hugging a small plush toy she had brought from home many years ago. It had been given to her by her mother for September 1. The toy had been gathering dust under the couch in a bag for years. But today, Jane found it. At dawn, Plush was wet with tears, his eyes swollen. Barely a clock showed. Jane realized it was time, or rather, it was already time. She frantically flipped through the phone book, looking for Aunt Clava's number. Having found it, the girl called the elderly woman, apologized repeatedly and with difficulty, but got Barbara's phone number from her. Her fingers twitched. Jane exhaled, hastily wiped a tear with the palm of her hand, and dialed the numbers. Hello, Barbara. You don't know me, but we need to talk. My name is Jane. I am Helga's youngest daughter, and I want to give you my share of the inheritance.